to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep.
The very first Thanksgiving. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine that late autumn morning, drifting across the wide clearing where the forest met the tidal marsh. The sky waited in a pale, quiet blue, the distant cry of a gull echoing somewhere over the water. The cold had begun to settle into the earth, creeping along frozen soil and the edges of the streams. But for now, the sun kept a fragile warmth that slipped across the golden grasses. It was the kind of day that felt suspended between seasons, half the year behind and half ahead, an in-between place where something new might take root. For the people of Patuxet and the remaining Wampanoag of the surrounding villages, the changing season had long been a time of preparation. Winter always tested the strength of families and the generosity of the spirits. But this year was different. This year, strangers from across the sea lived in the old Patuxet village. Strangers who had nearly died that first winter. Strangers who were still learning the ways of this land, like children learning to walk. They came from the direction of the rising sun, their ship like a wooden cliff, drifting toward the shore, carrying people with pale faces, thick wool garments, and eyes filled with both hope and a deep, trembling fear. Now, almost a full cycle of seasons later, these same strangers, calling themselves the English, were harvesting their first successful crops. Their fields, once empty and uncertain, now held rows of corn, pumpkins, squash, and barley. Along the edge of the clearing, where the forest shadows reached out like long fingers, smoke from their small houses curled slowly into the still morning air. In the centre of it, all stood a man the English called Squanto, to Squantum, to his own people, a man whose life, twisted by misfortune and fate, had become the bridge between two worlds. Years ago, he had been taken across the sea against his will, and years later had returned home only to find his entire village claimed by sickness. Now he chose to guide these weary newcomers, teaching them how to plant corn with fish, how to find berries and herbs in the forest, and how to follow the trails of deer and fowl. That morning, as he stepped through the thinning woods, he paused to watch the English gathering their harvest. Men bent over rows of pumpkins, women carried woven baskets filled with beans, and children chased each other between the stalks of drying corn. Their laughter lifted faintly in the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves. He had seen long hardship bend those people into something fragile, yet he had also seen a strange resilience in them, a desire to carve out a home in a place far different from the one they had left behind. Not far away, Governor William Bradford stood beside a crate of newly harvested barley, his worn boots pressed into the cool soil, and his cloak flapped lightly in the breeze. He ran a hand over the grain, letting the kernels slip through his fingers like tiny beads of polished wood. The harvest was modest, far smaller than the fields he remembered from England, but it was enough to carry them through the winter, enough to begin life rather than cling to survival. "We owe this season to Providence," Bradford murmured, though he glanced toward the tree line where Tisquantum walked. "And to our friends," he added in a softer voice. Behind him, several men from the colony arranged baskets of food, preparing for what would soon become a gathering, though none of them yet knew it would be remembered for centuries. For now, it was simply a gesture of gratitude, a feast to mark their survival and the unexpected friendships that had allowed it. Further east, near the broad marshes where fresh water met the salty tide, the Wampanoag Sachem Osamequang, whom the English called Massasoit, stood with a group of his men. They had come to observe, to protect, and perhaps to understand these newcomers. The alliance forged earlier in the year had brought a cautious peace. It was a fragile thread, but one both sides carefully tended. Massasoit looked toward the clearing with the steady eyes of a leader who weighed each moment. He saw the fields flourishing, heard the faint laughter, and felt the winds shifting. These English were unlike other threats his people had faced. They were small in number, weak in some ways, yet determined, and they carried weapons and knowledge that could reshape the balance of the land. He watched Squanto walk among them, and wondered again at the strange twists of fate that had returned that man to these shores. Squanto had become essential to the English, a guide, translator, advisor. To some, he was a hero. To others, a man caught between loyalties. To Massasoit, he was a reminder that the world was changing, and storms could rise in unexpected places. The sun climbed slowly through thin clouds as preparations continued. Children from the English settlement gathered firewood while women arranged herbs and vegetables near the cooking pits. The men sharpened their tools, cleaned their muskets, and inspected the fish they had caught early in the morning. A pair of wild turkeys hung nearby, their feathers still faintly shimmering in the light. Tisquantum approached Bradford and bowed his head slightly, a gesture he had adopted to ease communication with the English. "They come soon," Squanto said. "Massasoit and many men. They bring gifts." Bradford nodded. "Then let us honor them. This harvest is as much theirs as ours." Around them, the colony stirred with a blend of excitement and nervousness. Hosting a gathering with powerful native leaders was no simple task, but it felt right, felt necessary. The year had been harsh, but it had also forged bonds made stronger by shared hardship. The first group of Wampanoag appeared near midday, emerging from the forest with quiet grace. They moved like shadows among the trees, dozens of them stepping into the clearing, followed by dozens more. Warriors carried bows, arrows, and painted shields, though they held them with the ease of peace rather than the tension of battle. Women brought woven mats and baskets filled with berries, nuts, and smoked fish. Children walked carefully, observing the English with wide, curious eyes. Bradford and several of the English stepped forward, offering gestures of welcome. The tension of two worlds meeting hung briefly in the air like a held breath. Then Massasoit approached, his expression calm, his movements sure. Bradford extended his hand and Massasoit accepted it, sealing once more the fragile peace that had carried them through the storms of the past year. Food was brought forward. Fire pits crackled to life. A grenadier was offered by the Wampanoag, carried proudly by several warriors. The gift was generous, far more than the small colony expected, and Bradford bowed his head in gratitude. The English brought their corn, squash, and pumpkins, arranging them beside the smoked fish and berries the Wampanoag had brought. More and more people arrived until nearly 100 Wampanoag filled the clearing, their woven garments and painted patterns flickering in the firelight. Slowly, the two groups mingled. English children approached the Wampanoag children with shy smiles and hesitant gestures. Women exchanged herbs and learned new ways of cooking unfamiliar vegetables. Warriors and colonists compared tools, one showing a steel knife, the other demonstrating a bow carved from white cedar. Laughter rose in small pockets, uncertain at first, then warmer. For the first time since the English had landed on these shores, the clearing felt less like a battleground of fear and more like a place where shared humanity could take root. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, its warm glow washed the clearing in amber light. Smoke from the cooking fires curled upward, carrying the mingled scents of roasting meat, corn, and herbs. The English prepared barley bread while Wampanoag women arranged mats near the fire for the elders to sit. Tisquantum moved among both groups with quiet familiarity, translating words, calming misunderstandings, and offering guidance. At one point, Massasoit stood near Bradford, watching as several Englishmen struggled to gather all the food for the feast. "Your people work hard," the Sachem said through Squanto. Bradford exhaled deeply. "We struggled to live through that first winter, but we learn. Slowly, perhaps, but we learn." Massasoit nodded. "You learn the land learns you." Nearby, a group of Wampanoag warriors demonstrated a game of strength and balance. Englishmen watched with fascination as the warriors leapt over logs and bounded across the grass with movements like deer. Laughter erupted again when one of the English attempted the same leap and landed in a heap of dust, grinning as he brushed off his clothes. The day lengthened into evening. Fires burned brighter. Shadows deepened across the clearing. Conversations grew louder and warmer, mingling the languages of two worlds. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the firelight, the laughter, the quiet exchanges, there was a sense of something unfolding that none of them fully grasped. Not an event, not a ceremony, not even a tradition, but a moment, a meeting of lives, rooted in survival, respect, and the hope that two peoples could share a land without destroying each other, a hope as fragile as the fire's embers, yet bright enough to hold the darkness at bay. As night settled, torches were lit, casting long ribbons of gold across the clearing. The air carried the warmth of the fires, the scent of roasted meat, and the sound of drums played softly by Wampanoag singers. The English listened in awe as the rhythm beat gently like a heartbeat, ancient and steady. For some of them, who had endured storms, sickness, and hunger, the sound felt like a promise that life could still hold beauty even after loss. Tisquantum sat near one of the fires, watching the mingling of people, watching the slow weaving of a moment that would ripple through generations. He knew better than anyone that peace was never simple, never permanent. But tonight, at least, the land was calm. The people were fed. The hope of friendship, however fragile, was real. The stars emerged one by one, bright over the dark treetops. The moon began its slow ascent, silvering the marshes and the distant river. Laughter rose again across the clearing. Voices blended. Shadows danced against wooden walls and woven mats. And the night carried on, warm, flickering, alive with the beginning of something none of them could name. Something that would continue into the next day, and the next, stretching the gathering into 3 long days of games, stories, feasting, and quiet exchange. Something that would flow forward seamlessly into a second day, touched by the same soft sunlight and drifting autumn wind. When dawn returned, its light crept across the scattered embers of the fires, found the woven mats where Wampanoag families slept, and slid over the rough roofs of English houses. Birds sang from the treetops, their voices bright as though surprised to find two worlds still sharing the same clearing without tension, without fear, just the lingering warmth of the night before. The English stirred first, moving quietly so as not to disturb their guests. Some carried buckets of water from the nearby stream. Others stoked the central fire until it glowed red and alive. Their breath drifted in pale clouds as the cold morning deepened around them. They worked with gentle purpose, their bodies still aching from months of labor, hunger, and sickness, yet strengthened by the rare feeling that they were not alone in this vast, unfamiliar land. Not far away, Wampanoag hunters rose from their blankets of deerskin and woven reeds, stretching in the crisp air. The forest called to them with the rustle of leaves and the scent of damp soil. They had offered one deer the previous day, but their pride demanded that they contribute even more to the feast. In their culture, generosity was a sign of strength, of respect, and these newcomers, for all their strangeness and fragility, had extended friendship in a way few others from across the sea ever had. Massasoit's men moved silently through the trees, their footsteps so light that squirrels hardly noticed their passing. They carried bows and arrows, but also carried something less visible, the desire to ensure that this gathering remained a symbol of peace. Their sachem had watched the English closely. He had listened to their words, measured their intentions, and calculated the careful balance their presence required. Today was another opportunity to test that balance, to see if goodwill could grow roots deep enough to survive winter's cold. Back in the clearing, William Bradford stood near the fire, watching the smoke rise in slow spirals. He pressed his hands together, warming his fingers, and let his eyes drift across the mingling signs of two cultures sharing the same space. A few English women helped prepare corn and vegetables, while several Wampanoag women showed them the best way to season fish with crushed herbs and ash. English children crept near the edge of the woods, where Wampanoag children taught them how to weave small toys from reeds. Bradford exhaled a breath that fogged in the morning air. There had been a time, not so long ago, when he believed they would not live to see another autumn. The first winter had taken too many, and the memory still pressed on him like a stone carried in the heart. Yet here they were, surrounded by abundance they had grown, hunted and prepared with their own hands. And here, too, were the Wampanoag, men and women, who might have allowed them to perish, but instead chose alliance. He thought of Squanto then, the man who had bridged the vast gulf between them, a man whose kindness seemed rooted in both sorrow and purpose. Bradford wondered, briefly, quietly, what Squanto's heart felt as he walked between these two worlds, neither fully belonging to one nor the other. When Squanto emerged from the forest, carrying a handful of dried plants, Bradford offered him a grateful nod. "These will help flavor the fish," Squanto explained. "Your people like much salt, but salt is scarce. These herbs will help." Bradford smiled faintly. "We are grateful for anything that makes our food taste less like the sea." For a moment, they shared a small laugh, the kind that carries no weight, no burden, just a gentle acknowledgement of shared humanity. By late morning, the hunters returned. 4 deer, trophies of skill and endurance, were carried into the clearing. The English stepped back, stunned by the size and quantity of the offering. Children stared with wide eyes, whispers rising around them. One of the Wampanoag men spoke proudly, his voice echoing in the open space. Squanto translated, "They bring these to honor the bond between your people and theirs. They feast with you as friends." The English bowed their heads. Bradford closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. Governor or not, he felt something humble rise within him, a sense that this moment was far larger than any one man or one colony. The food was prepared again, but this day's meal was even more abundant. Deer roasted slowly over the fires, their savory scent drifting across the fields. Corn kernels crackled in clay pots, berries simmered with wild honey in hollowed gourds. The English women baked small loaves of bread with barley and ground pumpkin, their hands moving with practiced care. Steam rose from pots, smoke curled through the cold air, and laughter grew louder as the day brightened. Games began once the meal was underway. Wampanoag men challenged the English to foot races, swift sprints across the open clearing, their bodies moving with the grace of the forest animals they tracked. The English, unused to such contests, ran with heavy steps and hearty enthusiasm, sputtering into laughter when they collapsed onto the ground. Women from both groups watched with smiles, shaking their heads in amusement. Children played with sticks and stones, inventing new games born from the merging of two imaginations. Some of the English boys tried to mimic the Wampanoag skill of hitting a target with a small stone thrown from a leather sling. Most stones flew in awkward arcs, landing far from their intended place, but each attempt was met with cheers rather than judgment. As the sun reached its highest point, the feast began once more. The two peoples sat together on mats, stools, and logs. The roasted meat was distributed, thick slices carved carefully. Fish steamed on wooden platters. Cornbread broke easily in the hands. Everything smelled of earth, smoke, and the warmth of shared labor. Massasoit sat near the fire with Bradford, the two leaders eating in companionable silence for several moments before speaking. "You honor us," Bradford said through Squanto. "Your gifts are great." Massasoit nodded. "You honor us also. You give thanks. You share food. Not all strangers do this." Bradford considered this carefully. "We are strangers no longer. At least, I hope not." Massasoit's gaze lingered on the fire. "Peace is a living thing," he said. "It must be fed like this fire. If you do not feed it, it dies." Bradford followed his eyes to the flames. "Then we must keep feeding it, for both our peoples." A faint smile touched Massasoit's face, a rare expression, quiet and reserved. The moment felt small, yet the weight of it pressed deeply into Bradford's soul. The afternoon unfolded in warmth and movement. Stories were exchanged, some through Squanto's careful translation, others through gestures, laughter, and the universal language of shared experience. English settlers listened with awe as Wampanoag elders spoke of the lands and rivers, the spirits of the forest, and the long memory of their people. The Wampanoag listened in turn as English settlers shared tales of a distant homeland, of long voyages on treacherous seas, of a world far across the horizon. As evening approached, the sky deepened into shades of pink and gold. The fires crackled once more, and the clearing filled with shadows. Drums sounded again, steady and low, grounding everyone in the rhythm of the land. Some English closed their eyes, letting the music wash through them. Some watched the dancers move with fluid grace, their steps echoing the heartbeat of a world that existed long before the English arrived. Night gathered slowly, wrapping itself around the clearing like a gentle cloak. Stars pierced the darkening sky. The moon rose, bright and pale, and once again, the feast continued well past dusk, the fires reflecting in the eyes of every man, woman, and child. On the third day, the pattern repeated. Morning smoke rising, games beginning, food shared, laughter lifting above the treetops. But something had shifted now. The initial caution had softened into familiarity. People mingled more easily, offering gifts, showing tools, and learning skills. The English learned how to identify edible plants near the marsh. The Wampanoag learned how English families prepared certain grains. Bonds formed quietly, woven through small moments. A shared smile, a hand extended, a story told. Near the end of the third afternoon, Squanto sat alone for a short while at the edge of the clearing, listening to the sounds behind him. The mingled voices of two peoples drifted like a single river flowing through the valley. Though he did not speak it aloud, a part of him wondered what this moment would become in the years to come. Would it be remembered? Would it vanish like smoke carried off by the wind? Or would it transform into something larger than any of them expected? He closed his eyes and let the sunlight settle on his face. For now, at least, there was peace. For now, two peoples shared the land with respect. For now, the fears that had once filled the forest seemed distant. Bradford found him a short while later and placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. They simply sat together, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath them and hearing the laughter of the people behind them. As the sun dipped low, the English and the Wampanoag gathered for one final meal. The last of the roasted deer was carved. The remaining bread passed from hand to hand. Children, now laughing together without hesitation, carried water from the stream, splashing each other as they went. The air filled with gratitude that was not spoken in grand declarations, but lived through simple acts. Massasoit stood once more as the fire glowed bright, his face illuminated in flickering light. He spoke briefly, his voice steady and serene. Squanto translated, though many present understood the meaning even without words. Thanks for the food. Thanks for the peace. Thanks for the strength of the land that provided for them all. Bradford stood after him, offering a few quiet words of his own. Words of gratitude, humility, and hope. His voice trembled slightly with emotion, but he spoke from the heart. Around him, the English settlers bowed their heads. The Wampanoag listened respectfully. When both leaders stepped back, the fire crackled loudly, sparks lifting into the air like tiny stars seeking the sky. And as the meal continued, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, a deep sense of unity settled over the clearing. Not perfect unity, not permanent unity, but real, present, and alive. For 3 days, the forest had witnessed something extraordinary. Strangers sharing food, trust, stories, and hope. The land itself seemed to pause, holding the moment gently, as though afraid to disturb it. Late that final night, the fires burned low. Families on both sides settled into quiet conversation, their voices soft under the star-speckled sky. The marsh shimmered with pale moonlight. The distant ocean whispered against the shore, and the clearing, once a place of uncertainty and fear, now glowed softly with the warmth of human connection. When dawn rose again, the Wampanoag slowly prepared to leave. They packed their baskets, folded their mats, and gathered their belongings with calm precision. The English offered what small things they could: pieces of bread, dried fish, and simple tools. Nothing grand, but gifts of gratitude. Massasoit approached Bradford one last time, placing a hand over his heart before turning toward the forest. Bradford mirrored the gesture. Squanto watched, understanding that this moment, like so many before it, would shape the fragile future between their peoples. Then the Wampanoag disappeared among the trees, their footsteps fading into the quiet woods. The clearing felt larger in their absence, both peaceful and strangely empty. The English stood watching until the last shadow vanished. Slowly, life returned to its steady rhythm. The fields awaited tending. The houses needed repairs before winter. Children were called back to chores. The feast had been a pause, a precious, unexpected pause. But the world still turned. Yet something remained in the air, like the faint echo of a song. Something that settled into the soil, into memory, into the stories that would flow from one generation to the next. None of them knew how the years ahead would shape their alliance, or how history would remember these days. They did not think of traditions, or nations, or holidays. They thought only of survival, gratitude, and the fragile thread of peace they hoped would endure. As the English walked back toward their homes, the sun climbed above the treetops, bathing the village in soft light. Bradford paused at the doorway of his house, looking once more toward the forest where their guests had gone. He whispered a small prayer, one of thanks not just for the harvest, but for the moment of shared humanity that had carried them into a new season. Behind him, the village stirred. Ahead of him, winter waited. But within him, and within the hearts of all who had sat together for those 3 days, something quiet and sacred lived on. A memory born not of ceremony, but of kindness. A fire fed not by wood alone, but by hope. A beginning, not perfect, not guaranteed, but real. And so the first Thanksgiving settled into the land, like the last warmth of autumn before the long sleep of winter, a fleeting yet enduring promise that even in a world divided by oceans, language, and fear, people could still meet at a single table and find, if only for a moment, a way to be one. Sleep to history's mysteries, the lost continents. The world quiets around you as night settles in, and as your thoughts drift like distant tides against the darkened shore, we step softly into the half-remembered places of the earth. You breathe slowly, gently, letting the last traces of the day dissolve. The oceans deepen around us. The stars draw faint silver lines across the sky, and beneath that vastness lies a question as old as humanity itself. What vanished beneath the waves? What worlds were lost to time? Tonight we drift back, far back, into the silent waters of history's greatest mysteries. The lost continents, whispered in ancient texts and echoed in geological riddles, pull us into their quiet embrace. They are places that shimmer at the edge of memory, half myth, half possibility, suspended somewhere between science and dreams. They exist in that tranquil space where facts cradle legends, and where legends fall gently into the sea. Let your breathing settle into a soft rhythm. Let the mind loosen like soft sand under tide. We begin now. drifting across the surface of the world's forgotten lands. Far beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the water is still and old, colder than memory, darker than unlit caverns. Here lie the first whispers. Atlantis Plato's voice drifts through time like a quiet tide, telling of a grand island empire, rich in shining temples, wide avenues, and circular harbours carved with mathematical perfection. It was said to be larger than Libya and Asia combined, a jewel of the ancient world, until the sea claimed it in a single day and night of ruin. Imagine, for a moment, gliding silently above that deep ocean floor. The water stretches endlessly, a world without wind or wave in this nighttime calm. And somewhere far below, layered in silt and quiet darkness, may rest the faintest ghost of a world that once breathed. Stone pillars fallen like forgotten memories, pathways swallowed in shifting sand, the outlines of a city that may have lived only in story, or may have existed long before recorded time, when coastlines were younger and seas had not yet risen to swallow the world. Atlantis is the most famous of the lost continents, but it is only one dream among many. The earth has forgotten more shores than it remembers. But let your breath slow, like waves washing over worn stone. Far to the south, beyond the cold currents curling around Africa's edge, ancient sailors whispered of Lemuria, a continent stretching across the Indian Ocean, an ancestral homeland of forgotten peoples or vanished creatures. It was proposed in the days before plate tectonics, an attempt to explain mysteries of biology and migration, but its name lingered. Lemuria became a place not of science, but of imagination, lush, tropical, a cradle of early humanity, or lost civilizations whose temples now lie beneath coral and drifting sand. Some pictured it as swaying with emerald forests and rivers wide as seas. Others imagined tall white cities rising above turquoise lagoons. And in every imagining, Lemuria sank long before recorded memory, leaving only fragments in myths from India, Madagascar, Indonesia, and beyond. Now, imagine drifting above that warm sea. The moonlight rests over the water, like a thin sheet of silver. Beneath the surface, shadows shift as if remembering shorelines. Long vanished volcanic ridges curl upward like the silhouettes of broken mountains. The ocean floor drops and rises in quiet patterns, hinting at the possibility that once, long ago, something vast stood here, kissed by sun and wind. You float, weightless, letting your thoughts move slowly, gently. But let us drift farther still to the Pacific, largest, deepest expanse of water on Earth, a world unto itself, a place of silence older than civilization. Here lie legends that predate even the oldest stone carvings, the stories of Mu, long before modern theories. Mystics and Victorian explorers spoke of a continent stretching across the Pacific, home to a sophisticated ancient people who built temples and monuments across what are now small scattered islands. Perhaps Hawaii, Tahiti, Rapa Nui, Easter Island were once mountaintops of a vast land swallowed by the sea. Perhaps the colossal Moai statues are not signs of isolation, but remnants of a culture connected by land that is now gone. As you drift deeper into calm, imagine following the currents toward Rapa Nui. The waves lap gently around giant stone faces staring eternally toward the horizon behind them. Green slopes rise, and beyond them, ocean. Only ocean. Yet the Polynesian stories speak of Hiva, their ancestral home, a great island or continent destroyed in a cataclysm. And as your mind wanders softly through the night, you may picture lush valleys, stone temples, terraces crawling up mountainsides, all now buried beneath an endless Pacific blue. The idea of Mu lingers, not because it is proven, but because it resonates with something deep in the human spirit, a desire to understand where we came from and what worlds existed before us. The ocean holds so many secrets, and silence is often mistaken for absence. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the quiet flow through you like a warm tide. Across the world, ancient maps and legends speak of lands now swallowed or shifted. When Earth's crust moved and changed, when ice sheets melted and seas rose by hundreds of feet, entire landscapes vanished sunderland. Once a sprawling extension of Southeast Asia, was a vast, fertile region during the last ice age. Rivers wound through plains where now only the South China Sea lies. Human ancestors may have walked along great valleys and settled in coastal cities, now lost to the deep. Slowly, as the glaciers melted, the sea crept forward like a silent tide, filling riverbeds, covering forests, and turning mountains into islands. Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, and the Philippines are fragments of a world once whole, a world now hidden beneath warm tropical waters. Imagine traveling through these Pacific shallows in the soft night. The moon reveals faint shapes beneath the waves, ridges, plateaus, perhaps the outlines of ancient river channels. In the quiet of sleep, it is easy to imagine lights glowing faintly in the deep, lanterns of forgotten villages, or fires long extinguished, but remembered by the earth. Night deepens around us. We drift westward now, toward the Mediterranean, once far lower, carved by rivers flowing through what are now deep basins. When the Atlantic poured in millions of years ago, it transformed the landscape entirely. In this place of shifting seas and rising stones, some believed in the lost land of Tartessos, an ancient Iberian kingdom of silver and bronze, of traders and storytellers, swallowed by floods or earthquakes. Others imagined the long-lost island of Lyonesse off the coast of Britain, a land of saints and monasteries, drowned in a single night. Fishermen still tell of church bells ringing from beneath the waves. Whether myth or memory, such stories cling to coastlines everywhere, reminders that the sea slowly reclaims all things. Let your breathing soften. Let the weight of the past settle into a gentle whisper. Toward the far north, beneath ice and shifting tectonic plates, lies the mystery of Hyperborea, an ancient land of eternal spring in the frozen realms beyond the north wind. It appears in Greek text as a paradise untouched by war or sorrow. Some equated it with lands that once lay ice-free during warm epochs. Others saw it as pure myth. But the Earth's climate has shifted many times, and there were ages when the Arctic was green, wrapped in forests and warm breezes. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies evidence of ancient vegetation, lakes, and flowing rivers. Worlds erased not by water, but by ice. When your mind rests in the darkness of night, it becomes easier to imagine that once, far above the world, there flourished a land of gentle sunlight and unending calm. And still we drift. South now, to the rim of the Pacific, where the Bering Land Bridge once connected Asia and America. A broad plain, now lost beneath frigid waters, may have supported entire cultures, scattered settlements, and the first human migrations into the New World. The wind that blows over the Bering Sea carries the faintest echo of footsteps across a land long gone. And farther still, beneath the cold waves of the North Sea, lies Doggerland, once the heart of Europe's prehistoric world. It stretched between Britain and Scandinavia, teeming with wildlife, forests, and human settlers. Then, slowly, the sea rose. A tsunami struck, and the land faded, leaving behind only fishing nets that occasionally drag up bones, tools, and fragments of a forgotten life. All across the world, the Earth has erased continents, not always through sudden catastrophe, but often through slow, gentle transformation, like a tide reshaping a shoreline grain by grain. Let your thoughts drift like these grains. Let the quiet carry you. The stories of lost continents are not simply tales of destruction, but reminders of how deeply the world has changed. Shorelines are temporary mountains rise and fall. Forests become seas. Seas become deserts. Civilizations blossom and wither. The earth is ancient, far older than memory, older than legend, older than the words we use to describe time itself. You float now in a world of possibility, imagining coastlines lit by torchlight, temples glowing beneath starlit skies, entire continents alive with cultures that vanished long before anything was written in stone. You drift, calm and weightless, through the stories the ocean keeps. The sea is vast, and so are the memories hidden beneath it. And as we continue this quiet journey toward the deepest, oldest mysteries the planet has ever known, we move ever closer to the edge where myth and history begin to blur, where the ether whispers drift through the deep like soft currents, moving through time as effortlessly as the tide. And as we descend again into that vastness of quiet ocean and forgotten worlds, your breathing stays slow and gentle, like the steady rhythm of waves washing over an ancient shore. Darkness below grows thicker, but it is not a frightening darkness. It is warm, familiar, like a blanket of time settling over the earth, hiding secrets too old for writing, too large for memory. We drift deeper, letting the ancient waters guide us into places long submerged, long silent. Somewhere in that stillness, there lies an understanding that the continents beneath our feet are not fixed things. They shift, they drift, they crumble, and sometimes they vanish entirely. Just as the mind sheds thoughts as it moves toward rest, so too does the earth shed landscapes, trading mountains for plains, shores for seas, land for water. Entire worlds are born, erased, and reborn again across millions of years, each one slipping quietly into the next like a dream, fading into another dream. We drift now towards Zealandia, one of the most extraordinary lost continents of all. Unlike Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria, Zealandia is not legend but geological truth. Almost the size of Australia, it lies submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, with only the mountain peaks visible today, as New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a few scattered islands. For millions of years, it rose and fell with tectonic breath. Then, long ago, the sea gently swept across it, leaving only fragments above water. Imagine hovering above its drowned surface. The moonlight paints a soft silver glow across the waves. Beneath them lies a vast plateau, carved by rivers that have not run for tens of millions of years. There are valleys deep enough to hold entire mountain ranges, and mountains tall enough to once have scraped the sky. But all of it now rests under the weight of the ocean, a continent hiding in plain sight, a reminder that even the land we know today can slip quietly into the sea. You breathe softly, drifting. The water grows calm around us. To the west, beneath the Bay of Bengal, lies another mystery, the rumoured lost land of Kumari Kandam. In Tamil tradition, it was said to be a cradle of ancient civilization, a great southern continent connecting India to Antarctica. Modern geology tells another story, yet the legend persists in the hearts of millions. The tale of a land once filled with poets, scholars, and sages. Like many lost worlds, it may carry memories of real ancient floods. Coastal plains drowned by rising seas after the last ice age. Villages swallowed slowly as the shoreline crept inland. Imagine walking along a prehistoric coast where families once lived, where fires once burned, where waves once washed against soil, now hundreds of feet below the modern ocean. As the water rose, inch by inch, year by year, the land receded. Stories remained. Over time, the stories became legend, and legends became the lost continent of Kumari Kandam. The earth is shaped not only by mountains and seas, but also by memory, and memory changes shape as gently as waves smoothing stone. We drift now toward the middle of the Indian Ocean, where the seafloor reveals scars, ridges, plateaus, and sunken fragments of an ancient world. Beneath the Mauritius waters lies evidence of a lost microcontinent called Mauritia, hidden beneath layers of volcanic rock and coral. Long before humans walked the earth, Mauritius split and sank beneath the waves, leaving only Madagascar, India, and tiny island chains as hints of its existence. It had no cities, no temples, no people, but its disappearance shows how easily even whole continents can vanish, leaving only geological whispers behind. Let your shoulders relax, your breath slow and deep. The world grows quieter, softer, more distant. Around us, the planet's history stretches far beyond human memory. There were times when Earth's landmasses were assembled into supercontinents, Pangaea, Gondwana, Laurasia, vast sweeping realms where deserts stretched from horizon to horizon and forests ran unbroken across thousands of miles. But before these giants rose, others existed: Rodinia, Columbia, Nuna, each forming, breaking, drifting, and dissolving into oceans that have long since changed shape. Imagine watching continents move as if in slow motion. You stand on ancient stone while mountains rise like long, soft breaths the earth seas melt away. Rivers carve new paths, valleys deepen, islands drift apart. Everything shifts so slowly that it feels motionless, yet over millions of years, entire worlds rearrange themselves. This is the Earth's quiet truth. Continents are momentary arrangements in an ocean of time. And yet, even against this immense backdrop, human stories cling tightly to vanished lands. We hear echoes of them in Polynesian chants, in Greek philosophy, in Indian epics, in Egyptian priestly tales, and in medieval legends whispered across coastlines. Many cultures speak of lands taken by the sea, sometimes in violent storms, sometimes in gentle rises that unfolded over generations. These stories may not be literal histories, but they capture something true about humanity, that people remember the sea moving, rising, swallowing land. They remember coasts that no longer exist. They remember migrations forced by tides, and over thousands of years, these memories become mythic continents, lost to all but the imagination. Let your mind drift through this tapestry of ancient memory. Let it unravel gently, like mist over a calm morning shore. The Mediterranean hides traces of Bronze Age settlements drowned by earthquakes and shifting coastlines. The Black Sea may have once been a freshwater lake until the ocean broke through, flooding entire valleys. In Japan, sunken ruins off Yonaguni resemble step pyramids, carved by nature, perhaps, or shaped by early humans whose world was slowly overtaken by water. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers found stone structures covered in coral, hinting at settlements older than recorded civilization. Everywhere the sea touches land, the sea eventually takes it back. We drift west again toward the Atlantic. Beneath the waters near the Bahamas lie the Bimini Road, rectangular stones arranged in a pattern that some believe are remnants of an ancient civilization. More likely they are natural formations, but even so, their shape invites the imagination to wander. And imagination is part of what keeps lost continents alive. As you breathe softly, the story continues to unfold like a gentle tide. The Azores rise from a deep Atlantic ridge where volcanic mountains push through the sea. Some believe these islands were once peaks of a larger landmass. Ancient maps drawn before the discovery of the Americas showed phantom islands dotting this ocean. Antillia, Brazil, High Brazil, lands that sailors insisted they saw, even if no one could ever find them again. Perhaps they were tricks of light upon the water, perhaps they were misremembered coastlines, or perhaps, long ago when sea levels were lower, these places truly existed above the waves. As night wraps its calm around your thoughts, you drift through these possibilities without needing answers. The beauty of lost continents lies not in proving them, but in wondering about them. Far to the south, Antarctica itself may guard ancient landscapes buried beneath miles of ice, mountain ranges, valleys, and maybe lakes untouched for millions of years. There were ages when this icy world was covered in forests, where warm breezes carried moisture across a land now locked in frozen silence. Beneath its glaciers may rest fossils of unknown species, traces of climates long forgotten. Antarctica was once part of Gondwana, connected to Australia, Africa, India, South America. When these continents tore apart, Antarctica moved southward, slowly freezing into its modern stillness. Imagine that slow drift, the land becoming colder and quieter, the forests withering, the final rivers freezing into silence, the continent turning to ice, carrying inside it the memory of warm, ancient worlds now completely lost. You sink deeper into calm, and from these geological secrets, we return once more to the human stories, the legends that keep the world's imagination alive. For even if Atlantis never existed as a physical place, it exists as an idea, a reminder of fragility, of knowledge lost, of civilizations that rise and fall like tides. Lemuria symbolizes migration, the mystery of origins, the yearning to understand where humanity began. Mu represents the vastness of the Pacific and the deep time woven into island cultures. Kumari Kandam reflects ancient flood memories and the shifting of coastlines over millennia. All these stories are maps, not of land, but of longing. As you drift, the world grows softer around you. Thoughts slow, breathing settles. The continents of the earth fade into silhouettes beneath a dark ocean sky. Even if no ancient advanced civilizations existed on these lost continents, the planet is full of forgotten worlds, real landscapes that vanished beneath rising seas as the Ice Age ended. Entire regions the size of countries now lie underwater, filled with the remains of forests, plains, and possibly the footprints of people who lived close to the shifting shores. Wherever the ocean is deep, there is the possibility of what once was. Let your mind wander to the depths now. as though floating above the world in a gentle, timeless drift. The ocean is a vast library, its shelves made of stone, its pages written in layers of sediment. It keeps its stories locked beneath pressure and darkness, giving only subtle hints. A fossil lifted from the seabed, a submerged forest, a forgotten coastline revealed by sonar. The Earth holds more history than we can ever uncover, and more mysteries than we can ever solve. You drift now through the last currents of the story, carried by slow, rhythmic waves. The lost continents around you fade into silhouettes, quiet and unreachable, but comforting in their mystery. They remind us that the world is not static. It is alive, constantly shifting, constantly remembering and forgetting. The ocean hums softly, its surface smooth beneath a moonlit sky. Somewhere far below, untouched for ages, lie the remnants of landscapes we will never fully map, mountains worn by time, valleys deepened by ancient rivers, shorelines erased long before the first human drew breath. The earth is ancient, and we are only passing through its memories. And as the story settles into silence, you remain weightless, calm, drifting between the known and the unknown. There is no urgency here, no need for answers, only the soft comfort of possibility, of imagining worlds hidden just beyond reach. The continents that once were and may never be again rest beneath the sea in eternal quiet, but in your mind they drift on, glowing faintly like lanterns carried across dark waters, guiding you toward rest. You exhale slowly. The night deepens. The waves still. The lost continents fade into peaceful darkness, and you drift gently, softly, into sleep. Earth's forgotten continents whisper softly from the depths. The silent cathedrals of time, abandoned temples of forgotten faiths. By the time the world forgot the gods, their houses were already crumbling. Stone gives way slowly, more slowly than memory, so that the last worshipper may die centuries before the last column falls. Wind and rain go on whispering the names no one speaks, polishing the steps no one climbs. In that interval, between the fading of a faith and the collapse of its last sanctuary, something strange happens. Temples become cathedrals of time. I did not set out to find them. At least, that is what I said to myself the first night, when the airplane window showed a black ocean and a thin curve of moon, and the engine's hum merged with the ache behind my eyes. I told friends that I was doing research on comparative religion, on the archaeology of forgotten cults. It sounded polite, academic, respectable, but the truth is that I was tired of quick opinions and faster vanishing headlines, of gods that lasted 3 seasons of a streaming show and then were replaced. Tired of the way even the great religions, the living ones, were argued over like brands. Somewhere under that weariness was an impulse I could not quite name, a need to listen to something older than the noise. So I followed rumors, footnotes, and half-legible translations. I followed the way a strange name glows on a page, the way embers glow in ashes. I followed flights and buses and dirt roads, until one morning the sun hauled itself over a desert horizon, and I saw the first of the silent cathedrals. It rose from the plateau like a piece of dawn that had hardened into stone. From a distance the temple looked simple. 4 square walls and a flat roof, all of it carved from a pale glass-sheened rock that caught the light and scattered it. Up close, the simplicity dissolved into intricacy. Every surface was etched with lines so fine they were almost invisible. Rays, arcs, spirals, intersecting at strange angles. At first I thought of stars, then of something older than stars. My guide, a taciturn man in a sand-coloured scarf, stopped the jeep a respectful distance from the ruins. "We go on foot," he said. "Road ends here." And he searched for a word in English. "Voices." "What kind of voices?" I asked. He lifted one shoulder. "Place remembers. Some people hear it, some do not." His eyes flicked to mine. "You're the kind who hears, I think." The air tasted of dust and light. Heat was already uncoiling off the ground. The wind was cool and carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins. As we walked, the temple shifted subtly with each step, its edges blurring, like something seen underwater. Mirages wobbled on the horizon, but this structure remained unnervingly clear, unnervingly present. Up close, I saw that the entrance was a low, narrow slit, no taller than my shoulder. Above it, carved into the stone lintel, was a symbol, a circle broken in 3 places, with a tiny inverted triangle at its heart. "You know the name of this place?" I asked my guide. "It has no name," he said. "Or rather, too many. The old stories." He waved a hand. "Sky Temple. House of the First Light. Shrine of the goddess who turned away. People tell stories when they see something they do not understand. You don't believe any of them?" He thought about it. "I believe the stone. It is older than the stories. Stories follow stone, not the other way." Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The light, instead of fading, seemed to thicken, turning the air into something like pale honey. The hall beyond the entrance was narrow and long, its walls converging toward a point of brightness at the far end. My footsteps sounded small and disrespectful. Thin grooves ran along the floor, so shallow they were almost smooth. Where they met the walls, the etchings there flared into cascades of lines that curved around each other in dedications to geometry I could not read. "It's like a sundial," I murmured, tracing one line with my fingertip. The stone felt unexpectedly warm, as if heat were running inside it like blood. But inside, underground. "Not a sundial," said a voice from the shadows ahead. "At least, not for this sun." I started so violently I almost fell. My guide merely inclined his head, as though he had been expecting this. A man stepped out from the bright haze at the end of the hall. He wore clothes that could have been taken from any era, a plain dark coat, trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a wide-brimmed hat whose shape refused to settle on a century. There was nothing remarkable about his face, except that, like his clothes, it would not stay still in my mind. Every time I looked away and back, I was sure he had been younger, or older, or differently shaped around the eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, heart still thudding. I was told no one lived out here." "No one does," he said. "I only keep watch." He extended a hand. "You can call me the keeper, if it helps." "Of what?" I asked automatically. "Of dust, of stories, of the places in between." His hand was warm and dry, his grip both firm and oddly weightless, as though he might drift away if I let go. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" I hesitated. "To learn, perhaps." "Learning is a species of listening," he said. "Come." We walked together down the narrowing hall. My guide stayed at the entrance, muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer. The grooves in the floor deepened, and the lines on the walls grew denser, overlapping until they formed a shimmering lattice that hurt my eyes. There was a faith here once, the keeper said conversationally. They had no word for God, only for the one who was before. They believed the sky was a wound in the body of the universe, and that light was blood spilling through. That's vivid, I said. They were vivid people. They measured that blood with great care. He touched the wall with his fingertips, and for an instant the lines around his hand flared, like embers stirred by a breath. They carved the paths of suns you've never seen. They charted the turning of stars that were old when this planet was gas and fire. Time for them was not a river, but a cathedral. Rooms within rooms, all resonant at different frequencies. This place, his hand described a small arc, taking in the hall, the temple, the blazing sky beyond, was their tuning fork. We reached the far end of the hall. Instead of a sanctum or altar, there was a circular chamber open to the sky. The roof had been cut away, or perhaps it had never existed. Walls rose in a smooth curve, their surfaces carved with spiraling grooves that all led upward, converging on the ragged circle of blue. In the center of the floor, a shallow basin of the same glass-like stone held a faint trace of darkness, like a shadow that had run out of substance. There were no statues, no offerings, no relics. They worshipped time? I asked. In a sense. The keeper tilted his head back, eyes half closed against the glare. They worshipped the before, the possibility that what came first still vibrates through what came after, that by listening just right, they could hear the first note. And did they? He smiled faintly. For a while. Every faith hears its God for a while. That is how faith survives its birth. But there are no temples in this world whose worshippers do not eventually stop listening. The miracle is not that faiths die. He touched the basin with the back of his knuckles. It is that their houses remain, long enough to remember for them. A gust of wind swept into the chamber, bringing with it the smell of far-off rain. For an instant, the basin darkened, and I thought I saw movement there. Not a reflection of the sky, but of something deeper. A skyscape in which the stars were arranged in unfamiliar constellations, an ink-blue firmament streaked with slow, luminous rivers. Then the wind passed, and the illusion with it. What happened to them? I asked. People who built this place? What happens to all such people? The keeper said softly. The sky changed, slowly, then all at once. The wound shifted. Blood fell differently. Their measurements ceased to match the world. They had poured themselves into this tuning fork, and the note it gave back no longer fit. Some tried to adjust. Some clung to the old patterns, insisting the sky was wrong, not they. Some walked out into the desert and followed the receding constellations until they died of thirst, still counting. And the temple? The stone stayed. Long after the last believer lay forgotten in the sand, the grooves remained. The walls continued to sing in the language of a sky that no longer existed. He opened his hands as if balancing invisible weights. No one listened, and yet time listened. It always does. That is when these places become what they are now, the silent cathedrals. Silent? I echoed. It doesn't feel silent. He glanced at me. You hear them then? What are they saying? That depends on who you are when you arrive, he said, and who you will be when you leave. We stood together in the strange, cool light, listening to something that was not exactly sound. It was like feeling the pulse in your wrist, a rhythm that had always been there, but which you notice only when you stop and pay attention. Images rose unbidden in my mind. Generations kneeling on this stone, eyes raised to a long-gone sky, hands tracing grooves into rock with patient tools, a child pressing her ear to the basin to hear the echo of stars. The feeling was not reverence so much as recognition. The people who had prayed here were gone, their God silent, their sky replaced. The hunger that had built this temple, the hunger to locate themselves in something vast and enduring, felt familiar. After some unmeasured time, the keeper touched my elbow. "Come," he said, "there are other cathedrals. Time is patient, but your body is not. You will need food, water, sleep. You're coming with me?" I asked. "For a while, until we reach the next one." His smile was wry. "Besides, you may not find them without me. They do not appear on maps the way you think." On the drive back, my guide muttered about spirits and omens, and kindly but firmly refused my offer of extra payment if he would agree to take us to the second site. "This is as far as I go," he said, hand tightening on the steering wheel. "If you want more old stones, talk to your friend." My friend. I turned, but the keeper, who had sat in the jeep's shadow and spoken quietly with me moments before, was nowhere to be seen. Desert stretched unbroken on every side, shimmering with heat. "He left," my guide said with a shrug. "People like that, they come and go. You will see him again, if you're meant to." I almost protested that no one could have walked away into that open vastness without kicking up dust or leaving footprints. Instead, I closed my mouth, buckled my seatbelt, and watched the tempo recede in the rearview mirror. The sun climbed higher, turning the pale stone into a white flame against the sky. And then it was gone. For a time, my life seemed to resume its usual shape. There were hotel rooms and flights, emails and receipts, snippets of ordinary conversation. The memory of the desert temple faded at the edges, like a vivid dream. But I noticed myself pausing longer than necessary in museums, lingering in the rooms devoted to unknown cult, 3rd century BCE, or ritual object, culture undetermined. I found my eyes tracing the cracks in old statues, wondering what vibrations still lived in their stone. It was in a museum, in fact, that I saw the second cathedral. It was not the cathedral itself, of course. It lay many thousands of miles away, in a jungle I had never imagined visiting. It was a fragment, a borrowed piece, set behind glass with a neat label. Carved stone panel. Provenance: unknown river valley civilization, predating regional records. Symbolic imagery suggests ritual significance. The panel was no larger than a laptop screen, its edges worn and chipped. It showed a stylized archway surmounted by coiling vines, and beyond it a series of steps descending into waves. Above the arch, etched in delicate lines, was the same broken circle I had seen over the desert temple's door. Only here, the inverted triangle at its heart had been replaced with a tiny curling spiral. A small note at the bottom of the placard read, "Similar motifs found at submerged temple complex. Coordinates on file with research department." I stood there long enough that a security guard ambled over to ask if I was alright. "Fine," I said, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Could you tell me where these coordinates are? The submerged complex?" He gestured toward the help desk. "Ask there, but I doubt they'll give you that kind of information." They did not. The woman at the desk smiled apologetically and spoke of preservation, safety, the need for permits. I nodded and thanked her, and later that night, in the quiet of my hotel room, I searched for the fragment succession number in academic databases. There were papers, of course there were papers, discussing the river enclosure site, its puzzling isolation, its curious iconography. There were also, buried deeper, references to a certain independent consultant who sometimes appeared in field reports under titles like temporal site verification or non-standard chronology assessment. The name listed was not the keeper, of course, but the initials were the same. By that point, I was no longer pretending, even to myself, that I had stumbled into this. When you have heard a stone sing, you do not return easily to silence. The jungle was nothing like the desert, and yet they shared a certain density of time. In the desert, time lay exposed, flat and immense, unrumpled by foliage. In the jungle it grew in layers, leaf over leaf, vine over branch, fallen tree over stone. Every inch of ground seemed occupied by roots or rot or new growth, and the air hummed with insects and hidden birds. The boat that carried me upriver was a narrow wooden thing, its small engine coughing now and then in protest. The water was the color of old copper, opaque and slow-moving, carrying leaves, twigs, and the occasional startled fish. The local guide this time was a woman, older than my desert companion, her face cross-hatched with fine lines. She did not speak English, but she watched me with curious, amused eyes. We had been traveling for several hours when the river widened and the current slackened. The guide cut the engine and let the boat drift. Ahead, the water swirled around something that broke the surface, the corner of a stone block, slick with algae, its top just barely visible. "Altar," the guide said, tapping the stone with her paddle. Then she pointed beyond it, to where the river darkened. House below. A submerged temple lay entirely beneath the waterline, a drowned structure whose outlines could only be guessed at from the way the current moved. Here the river ran strangely cool, and when I trailed my fingers over the side, I felt not the solid resistance of expected depth, but an almost dizzying drop, as if the riverbed had fallen away into a chasm. I stared into the brown-green water, focusing past the reflections of clouds, until shapes began to emerge. Steps worn by countless feet descending into darkness, columns wrapped in trailing plants, carved reliefs of human figures, their faces eroded but their gestures intact, hands raised, not upward, but outward toward the river itself. "Goddess of the flood?" I guessed aloud. The guide shook her head, lips pulling back in something that was almost a smile and almost a grimace. "New goddess," she said slowly, searching for a word. Door? The river was a door. The temple was a hinge. The faithful had not come to appease some personified spirit of the water. They had come to slide open a passage between states. This much I could feel, and the way the hairs on my arms rose and the boat drifted over the submerged stairs. "You won't see much from here," said a voice at my shoulder. "The river is shy in the daytime." I did not start as violently as I had in the desert. Some part of me had been listening for that voice since I first saw the stone panel in the museum. "You're late," I said without turning. "Time is difficult to measure in places like this," the keeper replied. When I looked at him, he was sitting cross-legged in the stern of the boat, hat tipped back, bare feet trailing in the water. His coat was gone. He wore a short-sleeved shirt whose fabric clung damply to his arms. Beads of moisture glittered on his skin like tiny pearls. Besides, the river likes to decide these things. The guide did not appear to notice him. She sat at the bow, paddle resting across her knees, humming under her breath. "Is she—" I began. "She sees enough," the keeper said. "Not in the way you do, not in the way I do, but she has ferried archaeologists and pilgrims up this river for many years. She knows where it folds." "Folds?" He dipped his hand in the water, making small ripples. "Do you know how cloth bends when you gather it? Time does that too. Certain acts, repeated with enough belief, enough attention, can pinch the fabric of years. Shrines are often built at such pinches. Every prayer, every offering, tightens the fold, drawing different eras closer, until—" He snapped his fingers lightly. "You have a place where moments seep between centuries, very useful for those who wish to speak with their dead, or their gods, or their unborn descendants. And when no one comes anymore—" "Ah," he smiled. "And the fold does not simply straighten. It cannot. It is knotted now, like muscle grown around an old wound. The shrine falls silent, but the bend remains. Such places are resonant. Time eats its own tail there, in small, strange ways." We drifted over the submerged stairs again. This time, as I gazed down, the brown-green murk cleared for a heartbeat. I saw not just steps and shadows, but flickers of movement. People in garments woven from reeds, bearing clay jars. A procession of children scattering flower petals into the current. A woman with braided hair kneeling on the lowest step, arms spread as if to embrace the water. For an instant, her eyes rose to meet mine, and they held a grief so vast it cracked something in my chest. Then a leaf bumped against the side of the boat. The water clouded, and the vision dissolved. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "Yes," the keeper said quietly. "Who was she?" "Once, she was their doorkeeper. She knew the currents by taste, the moods of the river by the way it curved around her knees. When the tides of their history turned, she stood here and watched their world drown. There was nothing she could sacrifice that would have stopped it. The flood was not a god's wrath or a moral lesson. It was an upstream glacier melting, a tectonic plate shuddering. And yet, because she was keeper of the door, she felt responsible." "She still feels responsible," I said, my throat tight. "Time does not forgive as easily as you think," he said. "It does not punish either. It simply remembers, and in remembering, it holds certain gestures in place." The guide spoke then, in rapid phrases I could not follow, and pointed toward the shore. A tangle of roots and moss there concealed a narrow opening, a dark slit in the river bank. "Side door," the keeper said. "Come." The cave was damp, close, dripping with the slow patience of minerals. We walked single file, our flashlights picking out glistening stone formations and pale blind insects. The air smelled of earth, something else, a faint metallic tang, as if the river's blood had seeped into the rock. The passage widened abruptly into a cavern, whose ceiling was strung with stalactites, like petrified fangs. The floor sloped gently down toward a still pool. Its surface was so smooth it might have been stone, but when I stepped closer, I saw my reflection shiver. Around the pool's rim, set into the rock, were carvings, the same archway motif I'd seen on the museum panel, repeated and varied. Some arches opened onto stylized waves, others onto curling clouds, others onto blankness. This, said the keeper, was their inner temple. Here they made their exchanges. Exchanges? Memories for omens, promises for postponements. You would call it prayer, they called it bargaining. I knelt at the edge of the pool. In its still depths, the reflection of the cave roof seemed impossibly far away, as if the water opened into a vertical shaft rather than a shallow basin. When I reached out, intending to test its depth, the keeper's hand closed gently around my wrist. "Careful," he said. "This place is not as abandoned as it looks." As if to confirm that, a drop of water fell from a stalactite and hit the pool with a soft plink. Rings spread outward, distorting my reflection. For an instant, I saw not my own face, but a rapid sequence of others. A man with ritual scars across his cheeks, a girl with hair braided in riverine patterns, an old woman whose eyes were filmed with cataracts, but whose gaze still burned. "Are those the worshippers?" I asked, shaking. In a way, the keeper released my wrist. Little echoes, trapped in the knot of time here. When you remember someone intensely, you bind them into your personal past. When enough people remember together, they carve a kind of channel through time. And those people are gone, but the place remains. The channel can fill with reflections. "Ghosts," I said, "if you like, but not in the sense of spirits with unfinished business. Think of them as habits of memory the world itself has developed. These are places where time remembers how it was used." I thought of the river temple, visible only as broken outlines beneath the surface, of the woman on the steps, whose grief still vibrated in my bones. "Why show me this?" I whispered. "Why are you bringing me to these cathedrals?" The keeper crouched beside me. The pool's dim light picked out small lines around his eyes that I did not recall seeing before. "Because you are listening," he said. "Because you're tired of noise and hungry for the deeper hum beneath it. Because there is a danger in forgetting that everything you think is permanent will one day be a drowned stare or a desert groove, and yet the imprint of your gestures will endure. Because some stories are only complete when someone agrees to carry them forward, not as dogma, but as understanding." He dipped 2 fingers into the water. For a moment, the pool darkened, and in its depths I saw, not the past, but something that might have been the future. The same river, narrower, its banks choked with plastic and rusting metal, skyscrapers rising in the hazy distance, a small child peering into a muddy puddle between broken concrete slabs, her expression filled with the same aching curiosity I had felt in the desert temple. Then the vision passed. "This is the second cathedral," the keeper said softly. "There will be others. There is a monastery in the mountains that erased its own scriptures. There is a city underneath a city where every faith burned itself into frescoes no one can read. There is a temple above the clouds, and one below the ice." "And you keep them all?" I asked. "I visit," he said. "I listen. I speak when someone comes with the right kind of questions. Call it keeping, if you like. Time does not need a custodian, but humans often do. He rose and held out a hand. You are not done yet. The path is long. As I took his hand and let him lead me back through the dripping cave, the sense of walking, not just through space, but through a thickening weave of years, settled around me like a cloak. The silent cathedrals of time were not just ruins. They were mirrors in which my own era, my own restless, distracted age, might someday be reflected as a faint, shimmering image. Somewhere in an unimaginable future, a stranger might press their hand to a cracked screen or fragment of printed page and feel a faint echo of our questions. The thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. When we emerged from the cave into the blind white glare of day, the river roared past as if it had never paused. The guide shaded her eyes, looked at me and nodded once, as if something had been decided. You are not the first to come, the keeper said, and you will not be the last. Time is generous with its invitations, even if most people decline without knowing they were asked. How many more are there? I asked. His smile held both mischief and sorrow. Enough. We boarded the boat. The current took us, carrying us back towards settlements and roads and the thin skein of Wi-Fi that stitched the modern world together. But I felt as though a deeper current had caught me, one that flowed not just from upriver to downriver, but from before to after, from forgotten to not yet known. The silent cathedrals were waiting, their stones patient, their drowned steps steady under the weight of water. Somewhere in mountain air or city dust, other forgotten faiths had left their houses standing, not to demand worship, but to offer remembrance. I did not yet know their names, but time and the keeper would show me, and so the journey went on. The mountains greeted me with thin air and a silence that felt sharper than any I had known in desert or jungle. On the map, the region was a tangle of contour lines and sparse place names, a high range straddling the border between languages, between climates, between histories. Travelers came here to climb, to trek, to stand on ridges and take photographs of themselves against distant peaks. Very few came for the monastery that lay tucked in a side valley, several days' journey from the nearest marked trail. By then, I had learned that the world's forgotten sanctuaries seldom appeared where brochures suggested. The path up to the monastery wound through forests of stunted pines and over scree slopes, where every step sent small avalanches of stones clattering into the ravine below. My guide this time was a wiry young man with a calm smile and a habit of humming tunelessly under his breath. He had never heard of the place I described, but when I showed him my hand-drawn map, a composite of hints from old journals, expedition reports, and a half-deciphered inscription from a museum cellar, his eyes widened. My grandfather spoke of such a place, he said. The monastery that turned its back on the world. He said the monks there erased their own words. I thought it only a story to frighten children into finishing their lessons. We camped in the last scraps of tree line, where the wind combed the grass in restless waves. Stars came out in brittle, dazzling profusion. It was too cold for many insects, and the quiet was so complete that the crackle of the campfire sounded like distant thunder. I lay awake long after my guide's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Above me, the Milky Way arched like a pale scar across the sky. I thought of the desert temples' vanished constellations, of the river's remembered rituals, and wondered what kind of wound or healing had taken place in the monastery we were approaching. "You are closer than you think," said a voice from the darkness. I turned my head. The keeper sat at the edge of the firelight, hat in his hands, boots dusted with a thin sheen of frost. The light from the embers painted hollows under his cheekbones, and his eyes reflected the flames in pinpoints of gold. "You never seem to be out of breath," I said, "or hungry, or tired." "I get what I need in other places," he said, "not in ways you would find comforting." He tilted his head back to regard the stars. "This is a good sky. It belongs to more than one faith." "What do you mean?" "Think of all the pilgrims who walked under it," he said. "Followers of mountain gods and sun gods, hermits and poets, saints and skeptics, men and women who climbed these paths with hearts full of prayers, and others who simply came seeking a quiet hour away from the noise below. They all looked up. They all saw these stars. Whatever names they gave that experience, the light itself was common currency." "And the monastery?" I asked. "What did they see?" "For a long time, too long perhaps, they saw only their own reflections," he said. "Come, sleep if you can. Tomorrow you will see what's left." Morning was a slow unfurling of light over peaks and ridges. We packed our tent with numb fingers and set out along a narrow path that clung to the mountainside like a thought that would not fully form. The air grew thinner with each step, and my breath came in short, painful pulls. Then the trail rounded a shoulder of rock, and the monastery revealed itself. It clung to the cliff face as if grown from it, a cluster of stone buildings with sloping roofs, their wooden beams silvered with age. A long stairway, partly carved into the rock and partly constructed from rough-hewn blocks, led up to a heavy wooden gate. Colourful prayer flags once stretched from the roofs to poles sunk into the cliff, but time and weather had shredded them into faint, faded streamers. As we approached, my guide slowed, then stopped altogether. "I will not go further," he said, eyes fixed on the gate. "This place has a feeling. I do not like it." "You believe the stories your grandfather told, then?" I asked. "I believe my bones," he said simply. "They say no. I will wait here. If you do not return by sunset, I will go down and speak your name at the village shrine." "Is that a blessing?" I asked, attempting a smile. "It is whatever you need it to be," he replied gravely. I left him there and climbed the steps alone. Each one felt slightly different in height, as if they had been carved by many hands over many years, each mason making subtle adjustments based on his own stride. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense. The gate stood ajar. There was no lock, no chain, no sign forbidding entry. Only an absence, as if the building itself had drawn in a breath and never let it go. I stepped inside. The courtyard was larger than I'd expected, framed by cloistered walkways and low buildings. Empty flagpoles rattled softly in the wind. A well sat at its center, its stone lip worn smooth beyond the far wall. The mountains reared up, staggering in their indifference. This was not always an abandoned place, the keeper said, appearing beside the well, as if he had stepped out of my shadow. His breath did not smoke in the cold air. Mine did. "I gathered that much," I said. "They were devout, you know," he went on. "Devout in the way only those convinced of their own smallness can be. Their faith taught that words were traps, but to name the divine was to limit it. And so they praised their god in paradoxes and silence, in gestures and patterns. For centuries, this worked very well. We walked along the cloister. The walls were painted with murals, but at first glance they seemed nothing more than foggy smears of grey, brown, and faded blue. Figures emerged only when I looked closely. Kneeling monks, mountain spirits, stylized flames. All of them had been partially obscured by later brushstrokes of white, as if someone had tried to erase the images without quite succeeding. What happened? I asked. The same thing that happens to any system devoted to purity, the keeper said quietly. They turned inward. They began to fear contamination, not from enemies or outsiders, but from their own thoughts. Each time someone tried to articulate a teaching, another would point out the limitation in those words. Each attempt to praise their god was discovered to be inadequate, insulting even once examined. They became obsessed with erasing their own mistakes. He gestured toward the murals. These are not the work of iconoclasts from outside. This is the work of the monks themselves. They painted their vision of heaven, then repented for having dared to depict it, and covered it in white. They wrote hymns, then burned them for having presumed to describe the indescribable. We entered a long hall, whose walls were lined with shelves. At least they had once been. Now most of the shelves were empty, their wood carved with shallow, repetitive grooves, where scrolls or books had once rested. A few scraps of parchment lay scattered on the floor, their ink washed into illegibility by water or time. Eventually, the keeper said, they ceased creating and devoted themselves entirely to uncreating. They studied their own archives only to hunt for error. When they found what they deemed a dangerous phrase, they scraped it off the page and carefully recorded the act of scraping in another volume, which they would later also condemn as presumptuous and destroy. They saw this as a kind of holy pruning. They believed that if they removed every impure thought, what remained would be pure awareness. What remained? I asked, already knowing the answer. He spread his hands toward the empty shelves. This. They succeeded more completely than they intended. Their books are gone, their paintings obscured, their music forgotten. The last generation left behind detailed instructions for erasing even their own names. And yet the monastery stands, I said. Yes. He looked at me with something like pride. For all their efforts to disentangle themselves from history, they left a very clear imprint on time. Their devotion to erasure became, ironically, the most indelible part of their legacy. That is why this place is one of the cathedrals. I ran my fingers over the nearest shelf. The grooves in the wood felt oddly familiar, like an echo of the desert temple's lines and the river shrine's arches. Do they haunt it? I asked. The monks? Not in the way you mean. He led me to the far end of the hall, where a single book remained on a pedestal, wrapped in rotting cloth. Their ghosts are not personalities, but practices watch. He did not touch the book. Instead, he blew gently across its surface. Dust rose like smoke, swirling in the slanting light from a high window. For a moment, the particles hung in the air in patterns. Letters, words, sentences in a script I did not recognize. They seemed to form, hesitate, and then, as if ashamed of their own daring, disperse. Even now, the keeper murmured, the habit of erasure persists. This building has a reflex against being pinned down. Is there anything left of what they believed? I asked. Any trace of their God, their teachings? He thought for a long moment. They believed that the divine was what remained when you let go of every image, every idea, every story, he said at last. In that sense, their God is everywhere there is silence, here especially. We stood and listened. The silence was not empty. It was dense with things unsaid, with words that had once hung in the air and been carefully disassembled. It felt like standing in a library after a great fire, the phantom of knowledge lingering like heat on the walls. In that silence, I heard, faintly, the murmuring of my own age, the constant production of commentary, the endless stream of opinions, the fear of missing a moment, a trend, a phrase. For a heartbeat, I felt a fierce kinship with those monks, their longing to carve away the unnecessary to reveal something essential beneath. But I also saw their mistake. In their zeal to purify, they had cut themselves away not only from error, but from relationship. Their faith had become a mirror turned on itself until it reflected nothing at all. That is why it is valuable as a cathedral, the keeper said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Not because they were right or wrong, but because they show one way a human longing can twist when taken to its extreme. Time remembers such experiments. We left the hall and climbed a narrow stair to the rooftop. From there, the view was staggering. Mountains rising in serried ranks, valleys dropping away into blue haze, the sky an immense, translucent bowl overhead. Wind tugged at my clothes and slipped cold fingers into my hair. Once, they came up here to watch the dawn, the keeper said. They believed that if they could greet the first light without a single word arising in their minds, they would be free of all illusions. Did anyone succeed? I asked. He smiled. You tell me. We stood together as a cloud parted, and a shaft of sunlight slid across a distant peak, igniting it in gold. For a moment, all the stories fell away. Desert temples and drowned shrines, erased scriptures and coming ruins. There was only light on rock, and the thin, sweet sting of air in my lungs. No words came, or rather many did, but they felt redundant. The experience was already complete. After a long time, the keeper spoke again. You see, even here, in the ruins of their excess, there is something to learn, not as a dogma, but as a perspective. These places remember not only their builders' mistakes, but their glimpses of understanding. Is that why you call them cathedrals? I asked. I rarely call them anything, he said. You were the one who named them that, in your notes after the desert temple. Silent cathedrals of time. I liked the phrase. I stared at him. You read my notes? He shrugged. You leave them in places easy to find, on screens, in notebooks, in the backs of your thoughts. Time has a way of catching such things. His expression softened. Names matter. They shape how you attend to the world. You could have called these ruins dead religions or failed cults. You chose cathedrals of time. That tells me something about what you're ready to hear. And what is that? I asked. That you're beginning to see faith not as a set of answers, but as an ongoing conversation with what exceeds you, he said. And that you're ready to see how the conversation continues even after the words have been forgotten. We descended from the roof. As we left the monastery, I felt the silence stretch behind us, like a held breath finally released. My guide was waiting where I had left him, sitting on a rock and tossing small stones into the ravine. When he saw me, relief softened his features. "You went very still," he said. "Even from here, I could feel it." "Did you ever think of becoming a monk?" I asked impulsively. He laughed. "No. I like food and songs too much. My grandfather says a faith that forgets to dance is sick." We began the long journey back to the world of roads and networks. The mountains slowly receded behind us, their white peaks bright against the sky. Days folded into weeks. My life became a series of thresholds. Airport gates, station platforms, border crossings. Between each, a cathedral. There was the underground city, discovered beneath a modern metropolis when workers digging a new subway tunnel broke through into a frescoed chamber. Officially, it was sealed off for preservation. Unofficially, the keeper and I slipped in one damp evening, our flashlights catching gleams of gold and pigment on walls that told stories in a dozen styles. Here, a serpent god devouring its tail circled a Christian saint. There, a wheel of reincarnation turned beneath a crescent moon. Generations of conquerors had painted over each other's symbols, only for the next to do the same, until the walls were a palimpsest of devotion and triumph, fear and hope. No single faith remained intact. The cathedral there was not to a god, but to the human urge to inscribe meaning on stone. There was the cavern beneath a glacier, reachable only by crawling through a tunnel of blue ice. The air inside was so cold it burned. At its heart lay a ring of standing stones, slick with ancient frost, their arrangement calculated to catch the pale light filtering through the ice above. People who had built it were long gone, their culture obliterated by shifting climate and migrating beasts. But on certain days of the year, the keeper told me, the light still aligned perfectly, pouring down in a column that turned the frozen air into liquid gold. "A cathedral," he said to Patience. There was a small island in a great lake, occupied now only by birds. Once, a temple there had housed a statue of a god of echoes and returns. Now only the pedestal remained, its surface colonized by moss. When the wind blew just right between the rocks, the sound of the waves striking the shore resolved into something like chanting, a low, repetitive murmur that seemed to answer itself. Each place left an imprint on me, a texture, a mood, a question. Gradually, my sense of time shifted. The present felt less like a point on a line and more like a room in a vast building, connected by doorways to other rooms, some bright, some dark, some piled with forgotten furniture, others bare and echoing. One evening, as we sat on a hill overlooking a city whose lights spread out like spilled jewels, I asked the keeper, "Do the cathedrals ever end? Is there a last one?" "There is a last one for you," he said. "Time is long, your life is not. At some point, your body will say, 'Enough.'" "And for you?" I ventured. "Do they end for you?" He smiled in a way that made him look for a heartbeat, very tired. "I am not bound to time the way you are," he said. "But that does not mean I am free of it. I am. An arrangement it has tried on. One of the ways it has chosen to speak to itself. When I am no longer needed, I will unravel. Something else will take my place." "That sounds lonely," I said. "Loneliness is just a name for a certain arrangement of attention," he replied. When you're listening deeply, you're never truly alone. The last cathedral he showed me did not yet exist, or rather, it existed in more than one sense, folded into a knot of time I could only glimpse from the corner of my mind's eye. We met in a field on the outskirts of a sprawling city, under a sky lit not by stars, but by a dull orange haze. The air smelled of exhaust and distant rain. Construction cranes stood like skeletal fingers against the horizon. There, the keeper said, pointing toward a cluster of unfinished towers. Look. I looked. At first, I saw only the obvious. Concrete pillars, steel girders, glass panels reflecting the murky sky. Then, as I let my gaze soften, other images began to seep through. A soaring hall of light and shadow, its walls lined not with stone carvings, but with screens, 1,000 small rectangles, each displaying a different pattern of color and motion. People moved through the hall, their faces lit from below by the pale glow of devices in their hands. Some knelt, not before statues, but before abstract diagrams, immersive projections of data streams and orbits. Others sat in silence, eyes closed, listening to a hum that seemed to rise from the very bones of the building. "This is a temple?" I asked, startled. "In one branch of possibility," the keeper said, "a sanctuary built for a faith that has not yet fully named itself. A faith in human continuity, perhaps, or in consciousness as a pattern that can be stored and reassembled. They will call it many things. Some will come here believing they can pray themselves into servers. Others will come simply because it is quiet and beautiful." In the vision, I saw a child standing at the center of the hall, looking up at a ceiling that displayed a simulation of the universe. Galaxies wheeling in slow, stately arcs around her, murmured debates about ethics and personhood, identity and replication, rose and fell like incense. "What happens to it?" I asked. "What happens to all temples?" the keeper said. "It flourishes, it divides, is fought over, defended, abandoned. Its screens go dark when the power grid fails. Its servers decay. Moisture seeps into its walls. Centuries later, someone stands where you're standing now, staring at a fragment of its architecture protruding from a hillside, and wonders what those people believed." My chest tightened. "Then why show it to me?" "Because you live nearer to this possibility than to those we have seen," he said gently. "Because your choices, collective, not individual, will help determine whether this future faith is born gentle or cruel, inclusive or exclusive, attuned to the rest of the world, or sealed in its own hall of mirrors." "And the cathedral," I whispered, "will it be one too?" "Oh, yes." His eyes shone with a sober kind of joy. "Time will remember it, as it remembers all the places where humans try to speak with what they did not fully understand. It will be one of the silent cathedrals someday, just as your era's screens and towers will be. I am showing you so that, when you walk through your own temples, be they churches or offices, data centers or shopping malls, you will feel the weight of that continuity." The vision faded. The half-built towers stood in the orange glow, skeletal and ordinary. I looked at the keeper. "So, what am I meant to do with all this?" I asked. "I'm just one person. I've seen deserts and rivers, ice and stone, future screens and past walls. I've listened, like you said. But what now?" "Now," he said, "you remember. When you feel tempted to declare that your own time is uniquely enlightened or uniquely doomed, you remember these cathedrals. When you hear people speak with contempt of those who believe differently, you recall the care with which they carved stone, the patience with which they aligned their devotions to stars or rivers or empty air. When you yourself feel the tug toward erasing what you once held dear, you remember the monastery and ask whether you are pruning or cutting your own roots. "That doesn't sound like much," I said. "It is not spectacular," he agreed, "but it is how time stays honest with itself. It is also how you stay human in the face of your own impermanence." We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps crunching on gravel. The city's noise grew as we approached, a wash of engines and sirens, voices and vibrations. Somewhere a billboard flickered, its advertisement briefly glitching into a pattern of static that looked for an instant like a broken circle with a triangle at its heart. I stopped. "That symbol," I said. "I've seen it in every place we visited. Desert temple, river shrine, glacier cave, underground city. What is it?" He followed my gaze, then smiled. An old sigil, one of time's little jokes, perhaps, or one of the ways humans across ages and cultures have tried to draw the feeling of being between things. The circle broken, the point suspended in the center. "Between what?" I asked. "Between before and after," he said. "Between knowing and not knowing. Between worship and forgetting. The cathedrals all stand in such in-between places. So do you." "You too," I said. He inclined his head. "So do I." We reached a busy intersection. Pedestrians surged around us, each carrying a world of private rituals and unspoken beliefs. No one seemed to notice the thin, slightly out-of-place man at my side, or the way the light around him did not quite behave like the light around anyone else. "This is where we part for now," he said. "Will I see you again?" I asked. He considered. "In a way, you see me whenever you stand in an old doorway and feel the weight of years, whenever you touch a relic and sense that you're not the first to love or fear it, whether I am there as a person, in this shape." He shrugged. "Time will decide." I wanted to ask more about his origins, his nature, the mechanics of his appearances, but I had visited enough cathedrals by then to recognize that some doors should remain half open. Their power lay not in neat explanations, but in the spaces they left for wonder. Instead, I said, "Thank you for guiding me." "It is what I am arranged to do," he replied. Then softer, "And it has been pleasant. Not everyone who comes to these places listens as you have. Not everyone asks questions without demanding answers that fit in their pockets." He stepped back. The crowd flowed between us, a river of bodies. For an instant, his hat rose above the sea of heads like a small, dark boat. Then it was gone. I stood there in the heart of a living city, listening. Under the honk of horns and the buzz of electricity, I heard other sounds, the distant ring of a chisel on stone, the slap of river water against steps, the rasp of a brush scraping away pigment, the low chant of voices rising in a room lit by screens and stars. All of it was time, speaking in different registers. All of it was prayer, in a sense. Even the atheist's careful experiment, the skeptic's diligent question, the child's repetition of a rhyme she did not yet understand. Later, I would return to my work, framing what I had seen in words that could be printed, archived, argued over. Some readers would call it myth, others metaphor, others perhaps hallucination. That was all right. The cathedrals did not need belief. They had stone and water, ice and data, wind and light. They had the long, slow attention of time itself. But when I sat down to write, I began with a simple sentence, one that had grown in me over the miles and years. There are buildings that remember us better than we remember ourselves. From there, the stories unfolded of deserts and rivers, monasteries and glaciers, underground cities and future halls. I wrote them not as instructions, but as invitations, not to worship, but to listen. Somewhere, in a temple whose roof had fallen centuries before I was born, dust stirred. In a drowned stairwell, a ripple passed through water, older than any of my words. In a mountain hall of empty shells, the air seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. And in the great cathedral without walls, the slow, turning architecture of time itself, a note sounded, very small, but very clear, and went on ringing long after my pen lifted from the page. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World. The sea was a slow, breathing thing that night, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Above it, the sky curved vast and dark, its stars pricked into existence like tiny fires along the roof of the world. A longship rode those gentle swells, its dragon-headed prow cutting a quiet path through the moonlit water. The oars were drawn in, the sail slack, and the men aboard lay in cloaks and furs, drifting in a shallow, watchful sleep. Only one figure remained fully awake. Leif stood near the prow, one hand resting on the carved dragon's neck, his other hand wrapped around the leather strap of his cloak as the wind nudged at him. The air smelled of salt and old ice, like the breath of the northern seas he had known since childhood. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the curve of the ocean, lay Greenland, with its sharp cliffs and scattered settlements pressed up against the edge of the world they believed they knew. Ahead, there was only darkness and the whisper of something more. He listened to the water stroking the hull, the faint creak of wood, the soft exhale of sleeping men. It felt to him as though the ship moved not just across the ocean, but across time and memory, gliding toward a story that had been waiting centuries to be told his father's tales. The rumors told in Icelandic halls, the whispered accounts of a strange shoreline found by accident. All of them drifted through his mind like low clouds. They said there was land out here, land beyond Greenland, beyond the shifting floes and cold fogs, land with forests so thick you could walk among trees for days, land with rivers that ran clear and deep, land where grapes grew wild, where game was plentiful, where the air itself seemed gentler. Some had laughed at the idea, others had shrugged and let it pass like any other tale told next to a fire. But the story had grown roots in Leif's mind and taken hold. Now, as the ship glided under the stars, he felt that story pulling him forward. A soft footstep sounded behind him. "You do not sleep," came a low voice. Leif turned slightly. It was Tyrkir, the older man who had travelled with his family for so long. He was as much kin as any blood relative. His hair was threaded with grey, his beard thick, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Someone should watch the sea," Leif murmured. "The sea will still be here in the morning," Tyrkir replied gently. "It always is." Leif's gaze slipped back to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness, and the faint line where sea met sky. "Do you remember," he asked quietly, "what my father said?" About the land to the west? Tyrker stepped up beside him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. I remember many things your father said. Some of them were wise, some were spoken after too much mead. A faint smile touched his lips. But yes, I remember. A coast glimpsed in bad weather. A ship blown off course strange woods. No settlements, only the promise of what might be. Leif nodded slowly. It feels close, as if we have been drifting toward it our whole lives without knowing. Stories have a way of doing that, Tyrker said. They lie in wait until someone is willing to sail far enough to meet them. The wind shifted, stroking the sail. Somewhere in the darkness, a wave rose a little higher than the others, and then slumped beneath the hull with a soft, hollow sound. The motion swayed the men sleeping along the benches, but they did not wake. The night seemed to fold around the ship like a cloak, isolating it in a small moving circle of creaks and whispers. Sleep, Leif, Tyrker said at last. Morning will come whether you watch for it or not, and you will need clear eyes when it does. Leif hesitated, then nodded. He gave the dragon's head a final, absent pat, as if to reassure the ship itself, and made his way back toward the center of the longship. He lay down among his men, the boards cool beneath him, his cloak scratching lightly against his cheek. The motion of the sea cradled him, slow and patient. His thoughts drifted backward, to Greenland, to Iceland, to the tales of the old country across the ocean, but always, like a needle returning to north, his mind turned toward that unnamed shore ahead. He imagined it dimly, a line of land appearing out of morning mist, and as the rocking lulled him at last toward sleep, he felt as though that distant coastline was already watching them approach. Morning stole into the sky gradually, the stars fading one by one, as if some unseen hand were gently snuffing them out. A pale band of light appeared in the east, spreading across the water until the sea shivered with brightness. The men stirred, rolling in their cloaks, blinking at the day. Oars were quietly shifted. A few muttered prayers. Someone coughed, the sound swallowed quickly by the open air. Leif rose, his muscles stiff, but his thoughts sharp. The wind had strengthened, and the sail now caught it, full and rounded, drawing the ship forward with renewed purpose. Foam hissed along the sides. Above, a few seabirds circled, white and grey against the lightning sky. He watched them, feeling his heart quicken. We are still far from known waters, one of the men murmured, stepping to stand beside him. It was Bjarni, broad-shouldered, with sunburned cheeks and a steady gaze. Yet there are birds. Birds mean land, Leif replied quietly. Somewhere ahead, somewhere near. They do not drift so far from shore for nothing. They sailed on. The hours of the day seemed to stretch and thin, like threads pulled slowly from a loom. The men rowed in turns when the wind slackened, their oars dipping in and out of the water with the slow, unhurried rhythm of practiced work. When the breeze returned, they rested, letting the ship glide. They ate simply, dried fish, bread hard as wood, water carefully portioned, and spoke little. The ocean had a way of taking speech and folding it back into itself until silence felt more natural. But in each quiet glance toward the horizon, there was an unspoken question. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the world shifted. A darker line appeared along the edge of the water, so faint at first it was easy to mistake it for a trick of light, or a cloud bank hanging low. Yet as the longship moved steadily forward, that line did not dissolve. Instead, it grew more distinct, separating itself from sea and sky. The closer they came, the more it took on shape, a low, rolling shadow that stretched across the distance. Leif's breath caught. Without meaning to, he placed a hand again on the dragon's head, as he had in the night, as if seeking balance. "Land," someone whispered. The words spread softly along the length of the ship. Men rose from their benches, squinting against the light, craning their necks. Tirkir moved forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the distant shoreline. "This is no ice," he said after a moment. "No floating bergs, no broken fields of white. This is earth." The ship pressed on. The air began to change as the day dipped lower, carrying scents that were not of the open sea. There was a hint of moss, of soil warmed beneath unseen trees, of something green and quiet. The men fell even more silent, each feeling in his own way the strange intimacy of approaching a land no one among them had ever known. Closer still, and they could see that the coastline was not sheer and forbidding, but gathered into soft rises and dips. Low hills met the water, with darker bands of what could only be forest beyond. The sky above that distant land seemed somehow gentler, its colours washed with a faint, hazy gold. They felt a slow, deep calm settle over him. Fear, excitement, wonder, all of it blended into something steady. This was what he had come for, what the ship itself seemed made for, to slip across the unknown and press its prow against a shore that had, until now, existed only in half-remembered stories and scattered rumours. "Bring us in slowly," he said. "We'll look for a bay, a quiet place to land." The men bent to their work with a muted, reverent readiness. The longship angled nearer the shoreline, its sails shifting, oars dipping lightly to guide it. The water shallowed gradually, turning from deep indigo to softer hues, greenish and lit from beneath where the sun's light reached toward the unseen bottom. In the distance, a small cove opened in the coastline, a sheltered curve where the land embraced the sea in a gentle arc. The approach was clear of rocks. The water, calm grasses trailed along the edge, and beyond them, a scatter of low shrubs and the first hints of taller trees, their leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. "That will do," Leif murmured. They glided into the cove as evening colours thickened in the sky. The oars pulled back. The men prepared the anchor stone, letting it slide down with a soft, muffled splash. The longship settled into stillness, the faint rocking of the water, now a reassuring cradle rather than a ceaseless journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They listened to the soft lap of waves against the hull, to the distant rustle of leaves on unknown trees, to the calls of birds they did not recognize. The land, so close now, seemed to breathe quietly, an immense presence that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. Leif drew in a slow breath of air that tasted of soil and growth, different from the sharp salt tang he had known for weeks. "We will go ashore," he said gently. "Not in a rush. Step by step, the sea has carried us far. Let us meet this place with respect." They lowered a small boat and drifted toward the narrow strip of shore. The water around them was glassy, reflecting the subtle colours of the sky. As the keel brushed the sand, a quiet shiver passed through the men, as if they were crossing a boundary, not just of distance, but of time itself. Leaf stepped out first. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cool sand. The sensation was strangely profound, as if the earth itself were acknowledging him. He walked a little farther up the beach, until the sand gave way to firmer ground, then stopped and simply stood there. Behind him, the others followed, their footfalls soft. They spread out slowly, touching the low shrubs, bending to feel the texture of unfamiliar plants, lifting their faces to smell the air. No settlement greeted them, no smoke, no voices. Only the quiet murmur of the waves and the occasional call of a bird from the forest's edge. "This is it," Bjarni said quietly, his voice almost breath. "We have stepped onto a land that no one in our world truly knows." Leaf nodded. "We will learn its shape," he replied. "We will walk its forests, drink from its streams, and see what stories it holds. And we will carry those stories back, so others may know that the world is wider than they imagined." They moved inland a short distance, careful, unhurried. The ground rose gently, dotted with stones and small patches of grass. The trees beyond were tall and unfamiliar, their leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Shadows deepened among their trunks as the light faded, but it was not an unfriendly darkness. It felt alive, watchful, without being hostile. As they explored the edge of the woods, Tyrkir knelt beside a low vine that trailed across a small rise. Dark clusters of berries hung from it, heavy and ripe. He studied them intently, his face lit with an old, deep memory of other lands, other harvests. "Leif," he called softly. "Come see." Leif joined him, crouching beside the vine. Tyrkir plucked a berry, rolling it between his fingers. "I have seen the like before," he murmured, "back in the southern lands, beyond our northern seas. Grapes or something very like them. Grapes!" The word hung in the air like a promise. "This is a good place," Leif said at last. "A gentle place. Perhaps it will be our Vinland, a land of wine and growth." They did not shout or cheer. The moment was too large for that. Instead, they shared a quiet, steady look, the kind that passes between people who realize they're standing at the opening of a door that will never close again. They returned to the ship at dusk, the sky now brushed with long strokes of purple and deep blue. Stars kindled once more, scattered across the firmament. The men settled in, their voices soft, their movements slowed by a deep, peaceful fatigue that came not just from travel, but from the weight of what they had found. Leif lay awake for a time, listening to the mingled sounds of land and sea. The waves lapped gently against the hull. Somewhere in the nearby forest, a night creature called, an unfamiliar voice in the darkness, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present. He felt the world expanding around him, like the sea had once expanded in his imagination when he first heard tales of distant shores. Now, those shores were under his feet. The map in his mind was no longer bounded by the edges of old stories. It pushed outward, making room for this new coastline, these new trees, these new stars overhead. As sleep finally drew him under, it seemed to him that the dragon-headed ship, resting quietly in the cove, was no longer perched at the edge of the world. Instead, it lay anchored in the middle of a much larger, deeper mystery, one that would carry ripples far into the future, long after their names were forgotten. The night passed, and with the dawn, the work of understanding the land began. They spent the next days exploring the coast, moving carefully along the shoreline, landing where small rivers met the sea, where sheltered inlets offered calm waters, where the forest opened into gentle meadows. They moved like guests who did not yet know the language of their host, watching, listening, learning the quiet patterns of wind and grass and water. They found streams cold and clear, their beds lined with smooth stones. They found stands of tall trees, some dark and needled, others broad-leafed and shifting with every breath of wind. They saw birds whose calls were strange to their ears, and animals slipping through the underbrush, quick shadows in the greenery. At each landing, they left the place as undisturbed as they could, taking only what they needed, marking little. They built small fires, careful with the embers, letting the smoke drift upward in faint grey tendrils. As they sat around those fires at night, the faces of the men flickered in the glow, their eyes reflecting both the light of the flames and the unspoken wonder of being so far from home in a land that had never known their kind. Sometimes, as the embers settled and the conversation faded, someone would speak up softly, telling of other voyages, of Iceland's cold shores, of Greenland's hard edges, of storms weathered and ice fields skirted. Those stories, once the farthest reach of their imagination, now felt like steps along a path that had led here. Leif listened to them all with quiet attention. The more they walked this new coastline, the more he felt that they were not just adding to their own saga, but stitching this land into the larger fabric of the world they knew it had waited, silent and patient, while their people had sailed and settled the north. Now, at last, the threads had crossed. On one of those evenings, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered overhead in a calm, untroubled sky, Leif lifted his gaze and let it wander across the constellations he had followed since childhood, the familiar shapes that guided sailors across the vastness. "They have always been there," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The stars, the lands, the currents. We have only just learned to see the paths between them." Tyrkir, seated nearby, nodded slowly. "And others may walk those paths after us," he replied. "In time, this land will not be a whisper, but a place with a name spoken in many halls." Leif thought of that, of ships like theirs, of families, of settlements, of fires lit along this distant shore, voices rising in languages that had never touched this air before. The idea felt both distant and very close, like a shadow cast by a fire yet to be lit. For now, though, the land remained mostly untouched, their presence a small ripple in a vast, quiet sea of time. They would not stay long. Their purpose was to see, to know, to remember, and then to return. Yet even as they made their preparations, gathering small sample of wood and grapes and other signs of the richness they had found, a soft certainty settled in Leif's heart. This was not the end of the story. This was only the first line, spoken into the hush of a sleeping world. He felt it in the way the wind curled around the sail, in the way the waves welcomed the keel, in the way the forest watched them with a patience that suggested it expected more visitors in ages to come. When at last they turned the prow of the ship away from the shore and let the wind catch the sail for the journey back toward Greenland, Leif did not feel that they were leaving the land behind. Instead, it felt as though the memory of it had already travelled ahead of them, carried in the shape of the waves, in the flight of birds, in the changing light on the water. The longship moved smoothly across the sea, and the coastline slowly diminished, a dark line, then a smudge, then only an idea. But in the minds of those aboard, it remained vivid. The taste of the air, the softness of the sand beneath their boots, the rustle of leaves and trees that had never known the sound of their speech before. As night fell and the stars reappeared, steady and unchanging, Leaf lay awake once more beneath the sky. The same constellations that had accompanied them west now stretched overhead, guiding them eastward toward home. Yet home itself had shifted, its boundaries stretched by what they had seen. He closed his eyes and saw again the curve of that sheltered cove, the ripples along its surface, the way the forest waded just beyond the line of shore. The voyages, he realized, were not just paths cut through the sea. They were threads binding places together, making the world feel at once larger and more connected. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, he felt himself drifting gently toward sleep as the ship rocked and the waves whispered their long, slow lullaby. Years later, long after the first journey, when the memory of that gentle coastline settled into the hearts of many, other ships would follow. The ocean did not change its nature for them. It remained the same vast, restless being, breathing wind and wave, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. Yet the men who set out upon it were different. They carried with them the knowledge that the sea did not simply fall away into nothingness beyond Greenland. They knew there was land in that wide westward silence, land with forests and flowing waters, land where grapes and game and timber might be found. And so the voyages continued. One ship, smaller than Leif's, but sturdy and well made, set out from Greenland under a sky streaked with pale clouds. Among its crew were men and women who had heard the stories of Vinland as children, their imaginations shaped by the tales of their elders. Now, they wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. The leader of this voyage, Karlsefni, stood at the helm with a quiet determination. He had listened to life's accounts by the longhouse fire, had seen the wood and grapes and other tokens brought back from that distant shore. To him, Finland was not just a curiosity, it was a possibility, a place where families might settle, where farms might take root, where winter might be kinder than in the cold, hard lands of the north. As the ship rocked gently on the swells, his gaze travelled over the faces of those aboard. There were strong-armed sailors, used to hauling nets and rowing through sleet. There were women cradling children, their eyes bright with both worry and hope. There were older men, grey in hair, but still sharp of mind, who had seen many coasts and now wished to see one more. Crossing was not simple. There were days when fog wrapped itself around the ship so tightly that the world shrank to the sound of water against the hull and the feel of damp air on their skin. There were nights when the wind rose and the waves lifted them high, then dropped them deep into cold hollows, the ship's timbers groaning softly with the strain. Yet they held to their course, guided by the stars and currents, and by the quiet belief that beyond the arc of the sea, that remembered shore still waited. When, at last, the birds appeared and the scent of unseen earth drifted over the water, a murmur passed along the ship. People straightened, eyes turned eagerly toward the horizon. As before, the first sight of land came like a slow revelation, a dark line, a soft shape, a coastline emerging from haze. Karlsefni stood silent as they approached, his heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For him, this was more than the fulfillment of a story. It was the opening of a new chapter in the lives of those who had left behind their homes for the unknown. They found, not far from where Leif's ship had once anchored, a place that seemed well suited to their hopes. A gentle river flowed into the sea, its mouth widening into a sheltered bay. Meadows spread along its banks, and beyond them, forested hills rose in quiet layers. They landed cautiously, as Leif's crew had done years before, stepping onto the sand with a mixture of reverence and careful curiosity. But this time, there was more activity, more movement. They unloaded goods, tools, livestock. They walked the ground not just as visitors, but as people looking for the best places to build shelters, to plant crops, to tether animals. The land received them with the same quiet patience it had shown the first explorers. The river ran on, untroubled, its surface reflecting the sky. Birds flitted through the trees, indifferent to the newcomers. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. They built their first dwellings near the river's edge, simple structures of timber and turf, low but sturdy, their roofs blending into the land itself. Smoke soon began to curl upward from their hearths, thin grey lines against the sky. Children's voices, unsure at first, then more confident, mixed with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. At night, the people of this small settlement gathered around their fires, the glow casting gentle halos around their faces. They spoke of home, of Greenland's harsh winters, of Iceland's volcanic shores, of the old stories from Norway and beyond. Yet more and more, their words turned to this place, the feel of the soil beneath their hands, the taste of its water, the paths through its forests. They gave names to the river, to the bay, to the nearby hills, stitching their own language into the fabric of the land. Those names, carried on the wind and spoken over meals, warmed the place with a quiet familiarity. Yet they knew they were not alone in this wide world. In time, they saw signs that others lived here too. Not their kind, but people whose presence was written in the remains of fires, in tracks along the riverbank, in tools left near berry bushes. The first encounters were distant, a glimpse of figures in the trees, a canoe moving quietly along the far shore of the river, the echo of voices carried by the wind. Karlsefni, standing at the edge of the forest one morning, saw 3 figures watching from across a meadow. They were still as stones, yet he could feel their alertness even at a distance. He lifted his hand, palm open, a gesture as old as greeting itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the figures lifted a hand as well, mirroring his motion. The moment passed like a breath. The figures melted back into the trees, gone as silently as they had appeared. Life in the settlement unfolded in rhythms shaped by the land. They fished in the river, the lines dipping into water that ran quiet and deep. They hunted game in the forest, moving with care, learning where the deer passed, where the wild animals drank at dusk. They gathered berries and other plants, guided sometimes by what they already knew, sometimes by cautious experimentation. Season followed season. The days grew longer, then shorter, then longer again. The settlers began to sense how the year turned in this new place, how the light shifted and the winds changed. Winter came, but it was softer than the winters of Greenland. Snow fell, but it did not seem as heavy. The river froze along its edges, but not entirely. The forest, even in its bareness, felt alive. Yet with all the gentleness of the land, there were difficulties. Crops did not always grow as expected. The unfamiliar plants sometimes concealed dangers. Hunting could be uncertain. And beneath everything lay an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the invisible lines between their world and that of the Maple who already lived here were delicate. Sometimes at night, Karlsefni lay awake, listening to the sounds beyond the walls of his hall, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleepers, the distant hoot of an owl. He thought of how far they were from the familiar coasts of home, how thin the line of their presence was here. It felt like a small flame burning in a vast darkness, beautiful, hopeful, but fragile. He did not speak of this often. Instead, he rose each morning and joined in the work, repairing structures, planning hunting trips, walking the paths near the settlement's edge, watching the tree line where the forest began. Over time, the encounters with the native people of the land grew more frequent. There were moments of quiet exchange, a shared fish, a traded tool, a hesitant smile. There were moments of tension, when a movement was misunderstood or a boundary crossed unknowingly. The people of the settlement began to understand that they were not simply writing their own story here. They had entered into a story already in progress, one with its own deep roots and countless voices. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the river's surface turned to silver, Karlsefni stood with a small group near the edge of the settlement. A canoe approached along the river, paddled by two figures. They came slowly, without haste, their motions smooth and calm. When they drew near the shore, they paused, measuring the distance, measuring the faces watching them. Karlsefni stepped forward, leaving his weapons behind. He held out a small object, a piece of cloth dyed with a bright, rich color. The canoe's nearer paddler studied it for a moment, then reached into a woven bag and brought out a carved object, a small figure of wood shaped with care. They traded, hands crossing briefly over the water between canoe and shore. No words were shared that either side could understand. Yet in that exchange, something quiet passed between them, a recognition that, for all the distance and difference, they shared the same sky, the same river, the same night that would soon settle over the land. The voyages of the Vikings to this new world were not only journeys of distance, they were journeys of understanding, incomplete and fragile as all first meetings are. Those who came built their homes, but also carried with them the weight of their own history, their own ways of seeing the world. The land, already rich with the stories of those who had lived here for generations beyond counting, received them, but did not yield its entirety. In time, many of the settlers would leave. Some would find the uncertainties too great, tensions too wearing. Others would simply long for the familiar contours of their old homes. The sea, which had carried them here, would carry them back again. Their houses would stand for a while, then slowly dissolve into the earth, wood rotting, turf blending back into soil. Grass would grow where walls once stood. Trees would reclaim open spaces. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, indifferent to the brief presence of those who had paused along its banks. Yet the memory of these voyages would persist. In Greenland, in Iceland, in the far halls of Norway, tales would be told of Finland, the gentle land to the west where grapes grew and winters were kind. For some, the tales would be almost dreamlike, blurred at the edges, more myth than record. For others, they would be as real as the feel of salt spray on one's face. Parents would tell their children about the time their kin had crossed a vast unknown and touched a shore no one had known before. Around fires, in the dark of winter, voices would speak of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that carried sunlight along their surfaces, of birds whose cries were unlike any heard in the north. They would speak of canoes on quiet waters, of wary greetings, of the realization that the world was filled with many peoples, each with their own ways, their own understanding of the land. Generations would pass, the voyages would slip into the long river of memory, mingling with other tales of far journeys and harsh seas. Some would forget the exact details, names would fade, dates would blur, but the core of the story would remain, that once, long before many would believe or fully understand it, ships from the far north had sailed across the western sea and touched another continent. Far to the west, where the river flowed into the sea and the forest watched the shore, the land remembered in its own way. The old paths through the trees remained, traced by animals and people alike. The places where fires had once burned held a different quality to the soil, a subtle richness. A stone that had once been shaped by hands far from this place might lie half buried in the earth, moss creeping slowly over it, its meaning lost, yet its presence undeniable. Birds flew overhead, following their own inherited routes. Seasons turned. Children born in the villages of the land grew up with their own stories, some of which included mention of strangers in long boats, of brief visits, of small exchanges. For them, these were not tales of discovery, but of encounters, moments when different worlds brushed lightly against each other before moving apart again. The sea, indifferent to questions of who came first or who discovered whom, continued to rise and fall, its waves erasing and redrawing the shoreline in small, ceaseless ways. It remembered each ship that had crossed its surface only as a disturbance in its pattern, a momentary reordering of foam and current. Yet, in some sense, each voyage left an imprint, not in the water itself, but in the minds and hearts of those who sailed, and in the stories they carried home. Centuries later, when other ships from other lands would make similar crossings, guided by different maps and driven by different desires, the ocean would greet them with the same impartial motion, the land would receive them with the same quiet patience. New names would be given, new flags planted, new claims spoken. But beneath all of that, the older truth would remain. The world had always been wide, always filled with countless lives and stories, long before people set sail to measure it with their own eyes. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World were a part of that truth, a series of journeys that, like soft waves, rolled gently from one shore to another, leaving behind traces that would sometimes be forgotten, sometimes rediscovered. Their longships, with their dragon heads and curved hulls, were instruments of curiosity as much as of bravery, carrying not just warriors, but farmers, traders, families, dreams. In the quiet of a long northern night, when the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the walls, it was easy to imagine those longships again, to see them drifting under a sky sprayed with stars, their sails catching the pale light of the moon. To picture men wrapped in cloaks against the chill, staring into the darkness ahead, and wondering what shape the morning would bring to the edge of the sea. A storyteller, seated by the hearth, might pause and let the silence stretch. The listeners, leaning closer, would feel the hush deepen, as if the room itself were waiting. Then, in a soft, steady voice, the storyteller would speak of Leif and his men, stealing through the night toward a coastline they had only half believed in, of the first step onto that damp, cool sand, of the grapes on the vine, heavy and ripe beneath an unfamiliar sky, of Karlsefni's settlement beside the river, of the smoke rising in thin spirals, of the quiet exchanges along the water's edge. The words would flow like the sea, calm and unhurried, carrying the listeners in their minds across the centuries and over the waves, until they could almost feel the rocking of the longship beneath them, hear the creak of the timbers, smell the mingled scents of salt and pine and distant earth. Outside, the wind would go on blowing and the snow would keep falling, but inside, by the fire, the world would gently widen, the edges of the map softening and flowing outward to make space for that distant shore. In that moment, the voyages would not be something lost in the past. They would be happening again, here, in the quiet space between words and breath. The longships would be gliding once more toward a waiting coastline. The stars would be shining above them, as they always had, as they always would. And as the story settled into its final, soft cadence, as the listeners' eyes grew heavy and their thoughts began to drift, the sense would remain that the world is vast and filled with hidden coasts, that beyond each known horizon, there may lie a shore waiting peacefully for the moment someone is brave enough, or curious enough, to seek it. The fire would sink into embers. The room would dim. Sleep would fold itself gently around the listeners, as the memory of waves and distant forests and starlit sails lingered lightly in their minds. Somewhere in that hazy space between waking and dreams, they would feel themselves carried across a wide, calm sea, toward a distant line of land where the river meets the ocean and the trees whisper softly in a language older than any map. And there, upon that quiet shore, the voyages of the Vikings to the New World would go on, not as battles or conquests, but as a slow, enduring echo, a reminder that the world has always been broader, more mysterious, and more beautifully connected than any single story can fully contain. What really happened to JFK? The secrets hidden for 60 years. The sun hung warm and bright over Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, as though unaware that history was preparing to fracture. The presidential motorcade glided through the streets, waving crowds, leaning over barricades, the air shimmering with the excitement that followed President John F. Kennedy wherever he traveled. His open-top limousine reflected sunlight like a promise, a sense that the country stood on the edge of a new, confident era. The cheering was so loud that most would later recall it as a kind of continuous roar, until it wasn't. At 12:30 p.m., the world broke. 3 sharp cracks cut through the noise, dissonant and metallic. Some thought they were firecrackers. Others thought they were motorcycle backfires. But the way the president's body lurched, the way Jacqueline Kennedy reached toward him in a movement both desperate and confused, made the truth impossible to deny. The limousine accelerated. Governor Connolly slumped in agony, and within minutes they were racing toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The president would not leave it alive. The shock that spread through the country was immediate and paralyzing. People gathered around televisions and radios, their faces pale with disbelief. When Walter Cronkite removed his glasses and announced that Kennedy had died, a silence fell across the nation. A silence steeped not just in grief, but in a dawning sense that something colossal and incomprehensible had unfolded in Dallas. Within an hour, a name had surfaced. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and returned to the United States with a Russian wife. Police said he had fired the shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The story came quickly, cleanly, almost too neatly for some observers. Oswald himself famously insisted, "I'm just a patsy." He claimed he had been arrested not for murder, but for something larger, something he could not explain, before he was gunned down 2 days later in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Those 2 bullets, the ones that killed Kennedy and the one that killed Oswald, created a vacuum. Into that vacuum poured speculation, suspicion, and the uneasy feeling that the truth had splintered into pieces scattered across agencies, rivalries, and darkened rooms. The Warren Commission, assembled quickly in the aftermath, concluded in 1964 that Oswald acted alone. A single gunman, a single rifle. 3 shots. One man capable of altering the world's course. Yet almost immediately, reports, testimonies, and photographs raised questions. Witnesses said they heard shots from the grassy knoll. Doctors at Parkland described a wound in Kennedy's throat that looked like an entrance wound, not an exit. Records were sealed. Autopsy materials vanished or were replaced. Intelligence agencies were evasive, offering half answers and contradictory statements. It was as if the story had been stitched together and someone had pulled at the thread. As the decades passed, small leaks and partial disclosures kept the mystery alive. The Church Committee in the 1970s revealed wrongdoing in the CIA and FBI, unauthorized surveillance, plots to assassinate foreign leaders, and programs so secret that even their existence had been denied under oath. The committee's findings didn't prove a conspiracy in Dallas, but they indicated a pattern. A government willing to conceal, manipulate, and obscure. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Records Collection Act, promising that by October 2017, all remaining assassination-related documents would be made public. The country waited. Historians waited. Families waited. But when the deadline arrived, thousands of files were withheld again, this time under the justification of national security. The secrecy didn't silence speculation, it amplified it. What, people wondered, could still be so dangerous more than 50 years later? Meanwhile, researchers combed through the files that were released. Memos about Oswald's trips to Mexico City, surveillance reports on pro- and anti-Castro groups, warnings about threats to the president in Miami and Chicago, and details about individuals with intelligence ties who just happened to be in Dallas that day. Patterns emerged, strange coincidences, names that overlapped, but still, nothing definitive. The assassination became less a single event and more a landscape. A maze with shadows that shifted depending on where one stood. The official narrative remained, but so did the unanswered questions, the inconsistencies, the sudden deaths of witnesses, the missing records. As the country moved into the 2020s, calls for transparency intensified. Families of officials, historians, journalists, and even former intelligence officers urged the government to finally release the complete record. They argued that the last living individuals involved, though directly or indirectly, were now elderly or deceased. The Cold War was long over. Public deserved clarity. In 2022, another wave of documents was released, but still thousands remain classified or redacted. The National Archives cited agency objections. The CIA insisted that disclosure would compromise sources and methods that, remarkably, were still considered sensitive decades after the events. But then came the turning point. An independent panel of archivists, historians, and national security experts recommended the full release of all remaining files by mid-2025. Their argument was simple. The public interest outweighed any remaining national security concern. Pressure mounted. Requests from Congress grew. Public accountability became politically urgent. And then, quietly, steadily, the countdown to 2025 began. In the months leading up to the deadline, rumors swirled. Analysts whispered about a handful of documents, the so-called core files, that had never seen daylight. They were believed to include late 1963 communications between the CIA, FBI, and military intelligence units, intercepts from Mexico City, and a memo written shortly after Oswald's death that reportedly referenced something called the Contingency Monitoring Program. What this program was, no one knew, but its existence alone suggested a layer of observation or planning that had never been acknowledged. The president at the time signaled his intention to honor the deadline. It was a moment decades in the making. Archivists began preparing documents for release, scanning, reviewing, cataloguing. Agencies reluctantly cooperated, facing mounting pressure from Congress. By early 2025, the anticipation was palpable. Not because people expected a dramatic smoking gun, most experts doubted such a document existed, but because the mosaic was finally nearing completion. Thousands of pieces, scattered for more than 60 years, were about to be placed on the table at once. The truth, whatever it was, had been waiting beneath decades of secrecy, speculation, and conflicting narratives, and the world was finally ready to see it. The final releases of 2025 were more than just documents. They were the last breaths of a moment frozen in national memory. And as researchers sifted through the enormous archive, another layer of the narrative emerged. Not one of villainy, but of unintended tragedy woven through bureaucracy, caution, and Cold War paranoia. Every page seemed to echo the same message. The assassination was not just an event, but a collision of forces, each acting independently, each leaving a trail of confusion in its wake. Among the newly unsealed files were extensive interagency debates from the weeks following the assassination. The tone of these internal memos was frantic. Officials from the FBI, CIA, and military intelligence argued over how much to disclose, not only to investigators, but to each other. The fear of war with the Soviet Union, a fear that had defined nearly every political decision of the early 1960s, permeated every sentence. Leaders worried that if the public believed Kennedy had been killed by someone linked to Moscow or Havana, the calls for retaliation would be overwhelming. One memo written by a mid-level intelligence officer in late November 1963 revealed a haunting truth. Some officials believed that acknowledging their own pre-assassination awareness of Oswald's movements could be seen as gross negligence. They feared it would destroy public trust in national security institutions. And so, they lobbied to narrow the story. not to hide a conspiracy, but to hide their own failures. The 2025 declassification showed that these competing motivations led to fragmented communication. The Warren Commission received summaries instead of original files. Agencies withheld documents from each other, not out of malice, but because each believed the other could misinterpret or misuse sensitive intelligence. In some cases, officers simply feared political consequences. The truth was fractured before investigators ever arrived in Dallas. Perhaps the most surprising revelation in the 2025 files was the extent to which foreign intelligence agencies were monitoring events in the United States. At the time, newly unsealed diplomatic cables from the Soviet Union, Mexico, and several European nations showed that foreign governments were also scrambling to understand Oswald's motives. Soviet messages revealed deep alarm after the assassination. One cable, written within hours of the president's death, warned that if the United States believed Moscow had played any role, World War III could erupt within days. Soviet leaders issued urgent orders to purge any references to Oswald in their own intelligence files, fearing even innocent records could be misinterpreted. The result was an international chain reaction of secrecy. Nations were hiding details from each other, not to protect guilt, but to avoid catastrophic misunderstanding. The global landscape was so tense that even factual clarity carried risk. Yet the most poignant part of the 2025 release was not the political memos or interagency disputes. It was the personal reflections. Hidden for decades in classified archives were handwritten notes, private letters, and diary entries from investigators, military officers, and even White House staffers. Their words painted a picture of a government in mourning, confused, overwhelmed, and terrified of making the wrong move. One letter from a Secret Service agent assigned to the Dallas motorcade described the sleepless nights that followed. He wrote that he replayed the event in his mind every day, wondering what he could have changed. The route, the speed of the limousine, the position of officers on the running boards. His letter was never meant for the public. It was addressed to no one, found decades later in an archive box simply labeled Personal Correspondence, Restricted. Another set of documents showed the frantic internal debate over Kennedy's autopsy. Newly declassified medical reports revealed the pressure military pathologists faced as they attempted to reconcile contradictory wounds while keeping certain national security concerns in mind. Their notes showed uncertainty, not deceit. They were doctors caught in the middle of a security crisis. They had not been trained to navigate their early drafts, filled with crossed-out lines and rewritten observations, painted a picture of professionals under extraordinary pressure, working without complete information, their every decision scrutinized by higher authorities. As the public absorbed these details in 2025, the narrative of the assassination began to shift. The picture that emerged was neither the clean lone gunman story, nor the grand conspiracy many had imagined. Instead, it was a mosaic of human limitations, fragmented intelligence, geopolitical fear, institutional caution, and a chain of events that spiraled faster than any agency could control. The newly released files also shed light on the infamous Mexico City episode, long considered one of the murkiest elements of the case. The 2025 documents confirmed a long-suspected truth. Intelligence agencies never fully understood who the Oswald was, who appeared in surveillance photos from the Cuban and Soviet consulates. The files indicated that several officers privately believed the photographed man was not Lee Harvey Oswald at all, but an unidentified individual who resembled him. Why this person visited those consulates, why they used Oswald's name, and whether the real Oswald ever interacted with him, none of these questions were definitively answered, but the documents made one fact clear. Confusion in Mexico City led to misjudgments in Washington. Intelligence officers downplayed the inconsistencies after the assassination, hoping to avoid accusations of incompetence. Their efforts to simplify the narrative contributed to decades of confusion. A separate batch of files revealed extensive surveillance of Cuban exile groups operating within the United States. These groups, deeply opposed to Fidel Castro, were involved in numerous plots, some sanctioned by US intelligence, others rogue operations. In the weeks before Dallas, several members of these groups were traveling through Texas, including one individual whose newly revealed FBI file noted that he had been near Dealey Plaza in early November 1963. The 2025 files did not link him to the assassination, but they confirmed that multiple politically volatile figures were moving through Dallas at the same time, complicating the intelligence picture and fueling later speculation. Still, nothing in the 2025 files suggested that these individuals acted together or that they orchestrated Kennedy's death. Instead, the documents painted a portrait of a region filled with political tension, where many unrelated actors were operating simultaneously under the shadow of Cold War anxieties. One of the most powerful revelations from the 2025 release was the extent of internal disagreement within the CIA. Newly unsealed transcripts from closed-door discussions showed that some officers believed from the start that Oswald's background made him a potential threat. He was unpredictable, frustrated, and searching for identity. Others saw him as insignificant, a man whose political interests were inconsistent and poorly formed. These conflicting assessments were never reconciled, and no single office took full responsibility for monitoring him. The siloed structure of intelligence agencies meant that pieces of the puzzle remained scattered. One unit knew he had defected to the Soviet Union, another knew he had returned, another tracked his involvement in pro-Castro activities, and another recorded his visit to embassies in Mexico City. No one had the full picture. 2025 files revealed the chilling truth. Even if agencies had wanted to stop Oswald, the disjointed structure of intelligence at the time made it nearly impossible. Their systems were built for the Cold War, not for lone actors whose motives fell between political categories. Oswald was neither a Soviet agent nor a Cuban asset, neither a loyal Marine nor a stable civilian. He was, as one analyst wrote in a note discovered in the new release, a man who slipped through every crack we had. Perhaps the most unexpected documents in the release concern the days immediately after the assassination, when Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Newly unsealed communications revealed that Johnson privately worried that early evidence pointed toward foreign involvement. He feared that if the public interpreted the assassination as an act of war, the nation would demand retaliation before the truth could be fully understood. His private recordings, some transcribed for the first time in 2025, showed a man deeply aware of how fragile the geopolitical balance was. His urgency to create a single, stable narrative was driven not by deceit, but by national fear. These recordings showed Johnson repeatedly urging caution, warning that any premature conclusion could escalate into conflict. Some conversations revealed that he believed the Warren Commission's primary responsibility was to reassure the public, even if that meant simplifying the darker, more complicated edges of the truth. The Commission, composed of men who themselves feared the potential consequences of their findings, leaned into that sense of duty. Not to hide a conspiracy, but to maintain stability. The documents released in 2025 also contained fragments of testimony and interviews that had never been seen outside of classified rooms. Some of these statements were withheld for decades because they contradicted or complicated the Commission's findings. One interview with a federal agent suggested that witnesses who claimed to hear shots from multiple directions may have been influenced by the chaotic acoustics of Dealey Plaza. Another suggested that early photographic analysis had been inconsistent due to unreliable equipment and rushed development procedures. The release of these files did not resolve the long-standing debates over ballistics or trajectories, but they offered clarity. Confusion, not conspiracy, shaped much of the early evidence. Perhaps the most humanizing documents in the release were the letters written by Jacqueline Kennedy in the months following the assassination, while most of her personal correspondence remained sealed for privacy. A few previously classified notes concerning security matters were made public in 2025. In them, she expressed not only grief but also frustration at the conflicting reports she received from officials. She struggled to reconcile accounts of the assassination, medical findings, and the limited information she was given. Her letters revealed a woman seeking truth amid obscured narratives, a reminder that even those closest to the tragedy were left with unanswered questions. As historians worked through the extensive release, a unified picture finally began to emerge. It was not perfect. It was not simple, but it was grounded in evidence that had been scattered and withheld for over 6 decades. The assassination was now understood not as a clear-cut case of lone action or elaborate conspiracy, but as a moment where human error, geopolitical fear, institutional pressure, and fragmented intelligence collided in a single point of failure. The truth was not hidden because it was sinister. It was hidden because it was chaotic. 2025 files showed that agencies had been overwhelmed, under-coordinated, and fearful of consequences that ranged from political embarrassment to nuclear war. They simplified because complexity was dangerous. They redacted because uncertainty looked like guilt. They hid their own contradictions because admitting them could have shattered public trust during the most dangerous era of the Cold War. Yet now, with the full release, the public could finally see the assassination as history, not myth. It remained tragic, confusing, and emotionally charged, but it was no longer obscured by silence. In the end, the declassified files of 2025 did not provide a dramatic revelation. They provided something more valuable: context. They showed that the truth of November 22nd, 1963 was not a single story, but a tapestry woven from fear, miscommunication, secrecy, and the limits of institutions caught in crisis. The shadows that had surrounded the assassination for more than 60 years were not populated by sinister figures. They were populated by ordinary people facing extraordinary pressure. As the last pages were unsealed and the final memos uploaded, the weight of history lifted slightly. The nation, at long last, could look back on the tragedy, not through the haze of speculation, but through the clearer light of understanding. And with that clarity came something long overdue: the quiet, solemn closing of a chapter that had remained open for generations.